Hey everyone, thanks for checking out this video on WordPress development. This video is a preview from the complete WordPress developer course on Udemy. The first 4 hours are completely free. If you like this content, consider checking out the link in the description for the full course. Without further ado, let's get into WordPress development. Welcome to the WordPress development course. I'm super glad to have you on board. WordPress is the most popular content management system in the world. I've been working with WordPress for over a decade. My goal is to transfer all my knowledge of WordPress to you. Whether your goal is to become a professional developer or start your own site, I'm here to guide you every step of the way. Once we're finished, you'll be able to call yourself a professional WordPress developer. I know you're antsy to get started, but before jumping in, let's make sure we're on the same page. First things first, what can you expect to learn? Like I said before, my goal is to help you become a WordPress developer. This means we're going to create custom themes and plugins. We will cover topics from post types to extending the REST API with custom endpoints. Other topics include translations, block development, custom database tables, transients, data sanitization, optimizing code, etc. Not a single stone will be left unturned. WordPress provides a strong foundation for developing any type of site. Various tools and techniques will be explored to tackle the most common situations a WordPress developer will encounter. I have designed this course to be accessible to most skill levels. With that being said, there are some prerequisites for taking this course. Firstly, you should be able to handle basic WordPress administrative tasks without a problem. If I ask you to install a fresh site, upload a plugin, or create a post, that shouldn't be a problem. This course is not about performing basic administrative tasks. It's about programming. Secondly, you should have a solid understanding of HTML and CSS. WordPress utilizes 4 languages, which are HTML, CSS, PHP, and JavaScript. Covering these languages would take dozens of hours. As you can see, this course is already quite lengthy. To keep the course from becoming too long, I've excluded the basics of HTML and CSS. You are expected to know these languages. As for PHP and JavaScript, it's entirely optional to know them. If you have experience with programming, that's great. This course shouldn't be a challenge for you. For the rest of you, fear not. I have sections dedicated to these languages. Not only will you learn these languages, but you will be able to apply them to WordPress development practically. We're almost at the finish line. 2 more things before jumping into the course. From my experience, videos can be a great way to learn a new topic. Being able to follow along with someone is an extremely valuable experience. However, revisiting topics can be a burden. Along the way, you may forget some things. That's perfectly normal. Scrubbing through a video to revisit a fundamental concept can be tedious. For that reason, I've included a free PDF with this course. It summarizes the key concepts discussed in each lecture. I highly recommend downloading it for your convenience. Humans can read faster than they can watch videos. It's also a great way to review a lecture after watching a video. The free PDF book can be downloaded in the following lecture. Last but not least, feel free to ask me questions related to the course. I'd be lying if I said you wouldn't encounter problems. Programming is hard. Don't be afraid to ask for help in the Q&A section if you have questions. Typically, I will respond within 48 hours. I can only respond to questions that are specific to the course. Often, students will ask for help with their personal projects. Unfortunately, I can't provide guidance or consultation for personal projects, especially if you offer money. WordPress is an extensive tool with a large community. I can't cover every topic. I will try my best to cover the most common topics in WordPress development. I can't wait to get started. When you're ready, I'll see you in the next lecture. In this lecture, we're going to learn about environments. Before writing a single line of code, we need an environment to test our code. Naturally, WordPress cannot run without additional software. It requires an environment to be functional. That begs the question, What is an environment? An environment refers to the physical location where your code runs. It's a machine installed with software for executing a program. WordPress needs additional programs to be fully functional. There are two types of environments you'll come across. The first type of environment is a production environment. Typically, WordPress sites are hosted by a company with hundreds of servers. You may have purchased a server from one of these companies to host your WordPress site. Some examples would be SiteGround, Namecheap, or Kinsta. These companies will install the software required to run WordPress. On top of installing the necessary software, your site will be accessible to the public. Anyone with a link will be able to visit your site from their browser. We would consider this type of environment a production environment. Production environments are great for hosting a site, but not for development. They're not easy to update. Let's say a template needs to be updated. Files must be uploaded manually to a server. This process can take a while. Also, updating a live site can disrupt a user's experience. If you accidentally upload a broken file, visitors may receive errors. Production environments should have the most stable copy of your WordPress site. As developers, we need an environment that allows us to make as many breaking changes as possible. This is referred to as a development environment. Unlike a production environment, development environments are private. They're only accessible to us. If we break a site, that's perfectly fine. Users won't notice. We are free to experiment as much as we'd like. Development environments can be created on our machines. We don't need to purchase a server from a company. It's completely free to get an environment installed. There's just one problem. Various programs must be installed for running WordPress. Not only that, these programs need to be configured to work together. That's a lot of hassle. Luckily, we can avoid the trouble of creating an environment. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to a tool called Local. Local is a program for creating an environment on your personal desktop. It'll install and configure the software for running WordPress. Local is my favorite tool for WordPress development. Before moving on to the following lecture, I want you to download and install this program. Installing this program is like installing any other program. Just click Next until you've reached the end. You may need to provide your email before downloading the program. However, this program is entirely free. Local is not the only program available for creating a development environment for WordPress. If you prefer to use another program for running WordPress, that's perfectly fine. As long as you can run WordPress on your machine, you're good to go. For this course, I'm going to be using Local. Once you've installed it, let's begin installing WordPress in the next lecture. In this lecture, we are going to be installing WordPress. As I mentioned in the previous lecture, I will be using Local. If you're following along with me, we can walk through the installation process together. I have the app opened on my computer. Your copy of the program may look slightly different than mine. I've already created a couple of projects with Local. We can create a new site by clicking on the plus button at the bottom left corner. Almost immediately, we will be asked to give our site a name. For this course, I'm going to set the name to Udemy. Below the input, there are additional advanced options. I don't recommend modifying these settings unless you know what you're doing. It's unnecessary to alter these options. Let's continue to the next step. Afterward, we can start configuring our environment. Like I said before, WordPress needs additional software to be fully functional. Specifically, it's going to need 3 programs. Let's go through them one by one. I'm going to select the Custom option. According to Local, it's going to install 3 programs. Local will install PHP, a web server, and a database. The first program is called PHP. PHP is a programming language for the web. In general, programming languages are designed for giving instructions to a machine to perform actions. For example, we can tell a machine to send an email, create a user, or generate a page. There are dozens of programming languages available. So why PHP? WordPress is written with PHP. If our goal is to modify or extend WordPress, we must learn PHP. We can't use a different language. Luckily, PHP is a very popular programming language. In fact, 78% of sites are powered by this language. Almost 8 out of 10 websites are using PHP. There's no shortage of information on PHP development. It's considered beginner-friendly. I think it's a great language to learn. The second program is a web server. Computers need to be configured to deliver files to the browser. The job of a web server is to send files from the server to the browser. If the browser needs an image, the server will send an image. If the browser needs an HTML file, the server sends back an HTML file. So on and so forth. Without a web server, our computers won't be able to send the images to the browser. The responsibility of a web server is to expose files via an HTTP URL. In a future lecture, we will dive into the mechanics of a web server. This lecture is meant to give a high-level overview of the programs we're installing. The last program is a database. Databases are what you imagine they are. They are programs for storing information. We can store blog posts, users, and settings for a WordPress site. It's as simple as that. Local is going to ask us to configure these programs. For PHP, we can select a version. One of the benefits of using WordPress is its backward compatibility. We can install WordPress on older versions of PHP, such as version 5. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to a page of minimum requirements for WordPress. The WordPress team offers recommendations of the minimum versions of each software. For PHP, it's recommended to install version 7 or higher. While it's not against the rules to use an older version of PHP, your site becomes vulnerable to attacks. Older versions of PHP are not maintained. They have security flaws and bugs. You should always be working with the latest version of PHP, which is version 8. Back to the installer, let's select version 8. If there's a higher version than the version I've selected, feel free to select it. PHP ships new versions every year. The next option on this list is the web server. There are two options called Apache and Nginx. If you were to search online, there are dozens of debates surrounding these programs. Some users prefer Apache, others prefer Nginx. Regardless, they're both compatible with WordPress. For this course, we're going to be using Nginx. If you have experience with a specific web server, feel free to select it. It will not impact the theme and plugin we'll be building for this course. The last option is the database. WordPress supports two databases called MySQL and MariaDB. Initially, WordPress had sole support for MySQL. A couple of years ago, the developers of MySQL decided to create a new database called MariaDB. They didn't like the direction MySQL was heading. In a way, you can think of MariaDB as an alternative version of MySQL. Since that's the case, WordPress is compatible with MariaDB. For this course, it's not going to matter which database we use. There are differences, but these differences will not be explored in this course. Database management is considered a separate job. In my preference, I like working with MariaDB, so I'll select it. Feel free to choose MySQL. Let's continue to the next step. The final step will ask us to create a WordPress user. This user will be defined as an administrator of our site. We can configure the credentials for this account. I'm going to input basic login details. Keep in mind that our server is only accessible to us. The outside world does not have access to our site. Therefore, our site being hacked is not going to be an issue. After creating an account, click Add Site. After doing so, Local will begin installing these programs. This process may take a couple of minutes. Be patient. After installation, we'll be presented with an overview of our site. There are various options at our disposal for modifying the current environment. Before reviewing these options, let's test if our site is working. By default, local should have turned your server on. If not, you can enable your server by clicking on the Start button at the top right corner. After doing so, we can click on the Open Site button. A new tab will be opened in our browser. Without writing a single line of code, we were able to get WordPress up and running. Let's continue our discussion of the configuration in the next lecture. In this lecture, we will take a quick tour of local. We left off with creating a WordPress site. After creating a new site, we are provided a dashboard of options for our environment. I want to quickly review these options before moving further. The first step is to select our site. On the left side of the tool, there is a list of sites registered on our machine. Be sure to select the site we recently generated. On the right side, we'll be presented with various options. Initially, we are given an overview of our site. Firstly, we are given the domain. This domain is not officially registered. We can't provide this domain to other users. They won't be able to visit our site. Local has modified our machine's settings to intercept requests to this domain. If we send a request to this domain, it's going to deliver files from our WordPress site. In some cases, you may want to change the domain. That's possible by clicking on the Change button. For this course, I think the default domain works fine. Moving along, an SSL certificate has been generated for our site. Nowadays, Google will penalize sites that don't have a certificate. We want our development environments to reflect our production environments. It's handy to have a certificate installed for security. Certificates enable encryption for data sent between the server and browser. It keeps our users safe from hackers. In some cases, your browser may not allow you to visit your development environment. You may need to give extra permission by clicking on the Trusted button to force the browser to allow you to visit your site. If you are able to view your site, you do not need to perform this step. Next, we have the option of changing the web server. This is one of the most helpful features of local. You may not like Nginx. If that's the case, you can switch to Apache without creating a new server. On the other hand, you may be developing a commercial theme and plugin. Verifying your work on different web servers can be incredibly beneficial. The same goes for the PHP version. If you want compatibility with older versions of PHP, you can switch to an older version on the fly. Once again, it's unnecessary to create different environments for the same site. You can continue working with the same codebase. Unfortunately, the same can't be said about the database. Databases are more sensitive than the other two programs. We don't have the option of switching to another database. Luckily, it's not going to impact our code. Our code will be 100% compatible with MySQL and MariaDB. Afterward, we have the option of logging in as an admin. It can be annoying to constantly log into our site. If you want to skip this process, you can force your way in. This option may be disabled if your site is not running. Lastly, we are presented with the WordPress version and if multi-site is enabled. For this course, we're not going to learn about multi-site. That wraps up the Overview tab. There are two more tabs called Database and Tools. Let's shift our focus to the Database tab. This tab will present the credentials for your database. If you're not familiar with database connectivity, that's perfectly fine. Database management is a topic we'll cover in a future section. Besides installing programs for running WordPress, Local will install additional tools for debugging a WordPress site. One of the tools is called Adminer. You can click the open link to view this tool. After doing so, a new tab will be opened in your browser. We can interact with the database through this tool. Let's go back to Local. There's another tab called Tools. This tab contains a list of additional tools. We have the option of adding more tools with extensions. By default, Local will provide you with 2 additional tools. The first tool is called MailHog. MailHog is a program for creating an email server. Let's say you're creating a newsletter plugin. You may want to send emails from your development environment for testing purposes. MailHog will provide you with a fake email for receiving emails. This way, you don't need to pay for a third-party service for testing emails. It's a quick and easy way to test the email capabilities of your plugin. Lastly, we have a tool called Live. Local is capable of exposing your site to the public. This tool should be used cautiously. By going live, anyone in the world has access to your site, which is hosted on your personal machine. Therefore, they have direct access to your machine. The purpose of this feature is to allow your clients to preview your site without uploading it to a production environment. It's a powerful tool, but you should only provide links to people you trust. For this course, we aren't going to need this tool. There's one last feature to be aware of. Under the name, we'll be given the path to our project. If we click on this path, the File Explorer will open. This is probably the most crucial feature. We need to know where to find our files. There are a total of 3 folders. The first folder is called Configuration. As we discussed before, Local handles configuring the programs for running WordPress. You may not like the default configuration. If that's the case, you can find the configuration files for each program in this directory. For our project, the default configuration works fine. The second folder is called Logs. During the development lifecycle of a theme or plugin, you're likely to run into errors. Local will store a copy of errors produced by our site inside this directory. It's beneficial for debugging your site. The last directory is called App. If we peek inside this folder, we'll come across a public directory. This folder will contain the official files for WordPress. We're going to be working inside this directory for the majority of this course. There are hundreds of files, but soon enough, you'll become comfortable working with WordPress. Let's continue our discussion in the next lecture. Welcome to this section of the course. We're going to begin our journey by talking about the fundamentals of PHP. It's the language WordPress is written with. If you already know PHP, feel free to skip this section. Nothing groundbreaking will be taught in this section. So, what is PHP? It's a programming language that runs on servers to process web pages. Let's dive deeper into this definition. First and foremost, PHP is a programming language. A programming language allows us to give instructions to a machine. We can tell a machine to register a new user, upload a file, or process a purchase. There are dozens of programming languages available. It's possible to create a site with any of them. PHP sticks out from the bunch because it focuses on web development. Every feature it introduces is targeted at making web development easier. PHP powers over 79% of websites. So, for every 10 sites you visit, 8 of them are written with PHP. Its popularity and feature set make it the best language for WordPress to be written in. Let's talk about how PHP works. PHP can be installed on a server. A server is a computer that provides resources for running programs. Servers can be purchased, or we can convert our personal machines into one. In our case, we're going to be using a server to run PHP for web development. We can write PHP code inside a PHP file. Code written inside this file will perform any task we tell it to. PHP will only run on the machine it was installed on. If we install it on a server, it will only run on the server. It never runs in the browser. So, you may be wondering, how does the user know when something happens? PHP does something that no other language does out of the box. It will produce an HTML file. This step is optional, but in most cases, you will want to produce an HTML file. This file can be sent over to the browser. From that point, the browser will render the HTML file. PHP plays very nicely with HTML. A prerequisite to this course was knowledge of HTML. Since you know HTML, you already know how to write some PHP. This section is going to cover the basics of PHP code. Let's start by creating a PHP file. Currently, I'm pointing my editor to the WordPress project. I want you to do the same. If you forgot where your site is stored, let's quickly review how to find your project. You can open Local to grab the full path. On the Local dashboard, you can click on the button below the site's title. This button should open the File Explorer. As a reminder, WordPress's files can be found under the app/public directory. This directory is where your editor should be pointed to. After you've got your editor sorted, let's create a file. Inside the root directory of the WordPress site, create a file called test.php. PHP files have the PHP extension. Without this extension, our server will not process the PHP code written inside the file. Typically, it's considered bad practice to create files in the root directory of a WordPress site. However, I want to review the fundamentals of PHP. Before we dive into the code of WordPress, we should have a basic understanding of the PHP language. We're creating this file independently from WordPress. As we discussed before, PHP can render HTML. Therefore, we're allowed to write valid HTML inside this file. Let's create an h1 tag with some dummy text. Under normal circumstances, we would wrap this tag with HTML and body tags. For demonstration purposes, we'll keep it simple. The next step is to open this file in the browser. If you haven't already, turn your server on. Otherwise, we won't be able to view this file. Let's check out the site in our browser. Behind the scenes, Nginx is delivering this page. If we look closely at the URL, we're not accessing a specific file. By default, Nginx will hand over the request to WordPress. We can access a file by typing its name after the domain. In the address bar, we can type the name of the file. By default, the server is pointing to our WordPress site. Let's try accessing the test.php file. After doing so, we are presented with the file. Awesome! We don't need to type the full path to the file. The web server will automatically search for the file in the app/public directory. This feature is the main benefit of using a server. We don't need to type full paths in the address bar. A server can automatically serve files from a specific directory. We've successfully created our first PHP file. PHP files have the PHP extension. Inside a PHP file, we can write HTML. Does this mean PHP is running on the browser? The answer is no. To better understand, let's take a peek at the files received by the browser. On your keyboard, press the F12 key. This key should open the Chrome Developer Tools. If this toolset doesn't open, you can manually open this tool by clicking on the three dots top right corner. The Developer Tools can be found under the More Tools, Developer Tools menu. If you're not familiar with the Developer Tools, that's perfectly fine. I'll give a brief introduction. The Developer Tools are a suite of tools for debugging a site in the browser. For example, there's a panel called Elements. This panel will give you a preview of the HTML document in the browser. As you can see, our h1 tag can be found in the document. Additional tags have been added. By default, Chrome will inject the HTML, head, and body tags if they're missing from the document. The Elements panel is cool, but it's not what we're interested in. Let's shift our focus to the Network panel. This panel allows us to view files received by the server. Images, videos, CSS, and HTML files are some examples of files that can be sent by a server. It's possible this panel may be empty. If that's the case, refresh the page. After some time, the Network panel will display a table of files. You may receive different files. That's perfectly fine. The file we're interested in is the test.php file. In this table, various pieces of information are given to us, such as the file size. Let's focus our attention on the type column. This column will tell us the file type. For example, if we were viewing an image, the file type could be PNG or JPEG. For the test.php file, the type is set to document. The document type is the file type for an HTML file. Mysterious, right? Clearly, we are asking for a PHP file. Behind the scenes, PHP has produced an HTML file. This concept is important to understand. Whenever we ask for a PHP file, the server will process the code inside a PHP file. After it executes the code, the output of a PHP file is HTML. The HTML file is sent to the browser. Browsers will never see a line of PHP code. It'll always receive HTML. For this reason, the developer tools categorize the file as an HTML file. So far, we've got nothing exciting. Let's start learning some of PHP's features in the following lecture. In this lecture, we will learn the first feature of PHP called variables. Variables play an integral role in any language. They allow us to store values in our program. Do you remember math class? In math class, some equations can contain variables. For example, x plus 5 is an equation with a variable. The letter x can represent a numeric value. Variables in math function similarly to variables in PHP. We can create variables for storing values. Unlike math, we don't have to store numbers. We can store other types of data such as names, addresses, file data, etc. Variables are convenient because we reference them at a later point in time. Enough talk. Let's dig into the code. For this entire section, we're going to be working inside the test.php file. Before starting a lecture in this section, you should have this file opened. At the top of the file, let's add a pair of PHP tags. Follow along with me. Write the following code. Less than, question mark, PHP, question mark, greater than. We've written a pair of PHP tags. This is where PHP starts to become different from HTML. HTML is not known for being intelligent. We can't tell HTML to calculate values or output a set of tags if a condition is met. Whatever is written inside an HTML file gets outputted on the browser. This is where PHP comes into play. By adding an opening PHP tag, we can begin giving instructions. Code written inside this tag will be processed. We'll be able to perform complex logic from sending emails to processing a transaction. There are some rules to keep in mind. Firstly, we're not allowed to write HTML inside PHP tags. Otherwise, we may encounter an error. There is a way to write HTML, but we'll look at that later. We are allowed to write HTML outside the PHP tags. Secondly, we can create multiple PHP tags. We're not limited to a single pair of PHP tags. For example, I'll add another pair of PHP tags after the h1 tag. The code inside the first pair of PHP tags will be interpreted as PHP. The h1 tags will be interpreted as HTML. As for the second pair of PHP tags, they'll be interpreted as PHP. We are given flexibility with where PHP can be written. Lastly, it's optional to close a PHP tag. For example, if I were to remove the closing tag, everything would work. Omitting the closing tag is allowed as long as the file ends with PHP code. If we were to attempt to add HTML at the end of the file, we would get an error. Only PHP code is allowed inside a PHP tag. It's considered good practice not to include the closing PHP tag if you don't intend to write HTML after writing PHP. This practice makes our code readable. Let's adopt this practice in our PHP code. I'm going to leave an opening PHP tag in our file. Moving on, let's create a variable. After the opening PHP tag, we can begin to write PHP. Inside the tag, we're going to write a $sign symbol. The $ symbol is an instruction for telling PHP to define a variable. In the English language, we have rules for how it's spoken and written. We refer to these rules as grammar. Programming languages also have rules for how they're written. The rules for a programming language are called its syntax. If we want to write a variable, we need to type a $ symbol. PHP will understand we're trying to define a variable. The process of creating a variable is called a variable declaration. You may hear other developers say declaring a variable. The words creating or declaring are interchangeable terms. After typing the $ symbol, we need to give our variable a name. There are rules for how variables should be named. The first character in a variable name can only be a letter or underscore character. It can't start with a number. After the first character, we're allowed to use alphanumeric characters. This includes the underscore character. For our first variable, let's call it age. I'm using lowercase letters, but it's perfectly acceptable to use uppercase letters or a combination of both. After giving our variable a name, we're going to add a space followed by an =sign character. The =sign character will tell PHP to assign the variable a value. We can give our variable any value. For this example, we're creating a variable for our age. I want you to set this variable to your age. In my case, I'll set it to 28. The last step is to add a semicolon. In English, we must end our sentences with a period. It's how we let others know we're finished with our sentences. This same idea applies to programming languages. We need to tell PHP that we're finished with this line of code. Afterward, it'll start running the next line of code. Currently, we've written our variable on a single line. If you're writing a single line of code, this is perfectly fine. However, you may prefer to format your code. HTML can be written on a single line of code. For readability, HTML is written on multiple lines. This same practice is applied to PHP. We are allowed to add spacing before and after the variable. We will be formatting our code throughout the course. We'll get to more code in a moment, but first, let's try running this code. In your browser, try refreshing the page. Nothing happens. That's to be expected. We didn't do anything else besides create a variable. PHP won't do anything with the variable besides store it. Back in the editor, we can tell PHP to output the variable by typing the word echo. The echo keyword holds a special place in PHP. It'll tell our machine to output the value written after it. Let's tell it to output the age variable. We can reference a variable by typing its name with the $ character. PHP will search for a variable called age. If it finds this variable, it'll allow us to access the value stored in the variable. As a result, this line will output the age. Let's try rechecking the browser. Our age gets outputted on the page. Fantastic! We've created our first variable. Variables are one of the most commonly used features in the language. They allow us to store data. There's one more thing I want to mention before moving on. Variables are case sensitive. Below the first variable, let's create another variable called age assigned to 50. This time, the variable name will contain all uppercase letters. As far as PHP is concerned, these are two different variables. They have different casings. Therefore, our program will continue to output the value assigned to the first variable. If we recheck the browser, the first age gets rendered. If we want to override a variable's value, we need to reassign it. We can reassign a variable by typing the same code as before. Let's head back to the editor. Below the second age variable, we're going to set the age variable to 50. Pay close attention to the casing. The variables have the same name and casing. Let's check out the browser. This time, the output has changed. The number 50 gets rendered. So, that's how we can change the value of a variable. We have complete freedom over when and how a variable changes. PHP is very flexible in this regard. We'll continue our journey with PHP in the next lecture. In this lecture, we're going to learn about strings and booleans. We're not limited to working with numbers in PHP. Various values can be stored in a variable. PHP has a category system for variables. Let's discuss the categories before writing code. In PHP, there's a concept called data types. A data type describes the type of data stored in a variable. Every variable will have a data type. Assigning a data type to a variable is automated by the language. We don't have to take care of this process ourselves. Despite that, it's always good to have some understanding of data types. In the previous lecture, we worked with numbers. PHP will assign the integer data type to numbers. If we're working with decimal values, the data type would be called float. The next two data types are strings and booleans. We'll be discussing these two data types in a moment. Afterward, we have arrays and objects. These data types will have lectures of their own. The last data type is called null. A variable is null if it doesn't have a value. Here's an example of what a variable looks like without being assigned a value. It's optional to assign a value. If we decide not to assign a value, it'll be considered empty or null. You're still able to assign a value at a later time. It's not common to declare a variable without a value. However, there are some cases when you want to do this. For example, you may want to declare a variable because you'll need to use it later in your program, but don't have a value to assign it during declaration. Aside from numbers, strings are a common data type you'll be working with. Strings are the data type for raw text. We may want to store names, addresses, or paragraphs of text. If we're storing text, PHP will set the data type of a variable to string. The reason it's called string is because the text is made up of a sequence of characters that are strung together. It's a weird technical name, but you'll soon get used to it. In the editor, we're going to create a variable called name. The value of the variable will be a pair of single quotes. Strings are created by wrapping text with quotes. PHP will interpret this syntax as a string. Inside these quotes, we can write whatever we want. We can write gibberish, numbers, letters, spaces, and almost any character on your keyboard. There isn't a limit to what we can write inside these quotes. The value will be completely valid. Since the variable is called name, we should add our name. Next, we'll output the variable by typing the following: echo name. Be sure to include the semicolons. This is very important. Without a semicolon, PHP is unaware if we're finished with our line of code. Let's check out the browser for the output. Great! Our name appears in the browser. Strings are how we can store text. They're very simple to read and write. There's an alternative way to write text. Instead of using single quotes, we can wrap our text with double quotes. There isn't a difference between single quotes or double quotes. They'll both tell PHP to create a string. It's a matter of preference. I prefer to use single quotes because they're more readable. Use whichever you prefer. Let's move on to booleans. A boolean is a data type where the value is either true or false. I mean that quite literally. We're going to replace our code with a variable called isLoggedIn. The variable name is multi-worded. If we wanted to, we could write the entire variable name with lowercase letters. However, that can be difficult to read. One common practice is to capitalize each word except for the first word. This practice is known as camel casing. Another practice is to separate each word with an underscore. Keep in mind that underscore characters are valid in a variable name. We're going to be using camel casing for this course. It's more common than snake casing. Next, let's assign the variable to a value called true. If we type true, PHP will set the data type to a boolean. Booleans are a way to tell our program if something is true or false. For example, we may need to tell our program if a user is logged in. A good idea would be to store this value in a variable. A variable will keep track of the current authenticated status of the user. A boolean can only be one of two values. It can be true or false. In this example, we're setting it to true. Let's change it to false. Next, let's echo this variable. If we switch to the browser, nothing appears. It's because a false Boolean value will tell the program not to output anything. It's completely normal. If we had true, the number 1 would be outputted. PHP will not output the word true onto the screen. It'll convert the Boolean value into a number if we attempt to output it. You may be wondering, why does it matter which data type we use? Theoretically, we could stick to strings. However, it's essential to stick with the appropriate data type whenever possible. PHP will attempt to optimize our program based on the data types of our variables. For example, Booleans can only be one of two values. PHP never has to worry about a third value. Therefore, it'll be able to process our code much faster as opposed to a string. In addition, PHP can behave weirdly if we mix our data types. Throughout this course, we will get a lot of practice with different data types. You'll see how each data type can come in handy. We'll continue our studies in the next lecture. In this lecture, we are going to explore a feature called functions. Just like variables, functions are a common feature in PHP. They're heavily used in WordPress. A function is a block of code that can perform a specific task. To better understand, let's look at an example. In our file, let's clear the code inside the PHP tags. Next, let's echo a welcome message to the user. Previously, we would store a string in a variable. It's utterly acceptable to output a value rather than a variable. If you don't need to reuse a value, you may want to skip storing it in a variable. Let's shift our focus back to functions. The code we've written is not reusable. For example, let's say we want to output this message multiple times. To take it a step further, we may want to output this message in various files. Outputting the same message will require copying and pasting the same code. At first glance, that may seem fine, but it could lead to issues. What if we want to change the message? We would need to search for this line of code in various files. Each line would need to be updated. It's inconvenient and tedious. Ideally, we should be able to update this line once, and everything would reflect the update. Functions are the solution to our dilemma. Above this line of code, let's write the function keyword. Functions are defined with the function keyword. After typing this keyword, we can add a space followed by the function's name. We can call our function whatever we want. The naming rules for variables apply to functions. Let's call our function greeting. Next, let's add parentheses and curly brackets. The parentheses can contain a list of arguments. In a future lecture, we will revisit the topic of arguments. For now, we can safely ignore the parentheses. As for the curly brackets, they contain the body of the function. Inside these curly brackets, we can write additional code. Let's move the echo statement to inside the function. The purpose of a function is to outsource reusable code into a centralized location. By default, code inside functions is not executed. If we were to view the browser, the message would not get rendered on the page. Functions must be invoked after defining them. Let's give that a try. After the curly brackets, let's write the name of the function followed by a pair of parentheses. What we're doing is called calling a function. By calling a function, code written inside a function's curly brackets is executed. Let's check out the browser. The message from the function gets rendered. So far, this feature doesn't seem like anything special. What's the point of using a function? Functions are reusable. They can be called multiple times in our application. Let's try that out. Switch back to the editor. Let's try calling the greeting function a second time. By calling the greeting function twice, the code inside the function runs twice. Imagine if our function had 20 lines of code. Without functions, we would be copying and pasting the same block of code. That's not efficient. PHP introduces functions for reusing code. Whenever we want to reuse code, we can call it with a single line of code. Let's switch over to the browser. As you can see, the same message gets rendered. Overall, functions provide convenience. Our example is simple, but there aren't rules for how many lines of code can be written in a function. We can have 1 line of code or 20 lines of code. There's one more feature I want to show you. Let's head back to the editor. Earlier, we ignored the parentheses of a function definition. Now that we understand the basics of a function, let's take a moment to discuss this portion of the syntax. The parentheses store values passed onto the function. At the moment, our function will output the same message. It's not customizable. In some cases, we may want to modify a line of code in our function. For example, what if we're going to output different messages from our function? Would we need to define multiple functions? That would be inefficient. We can make our function flexible by adding parameters. Parameters are variables for functions. These variables can be configured during the function's execution. Inside the parentheses of the function, add a variable called message. Variables can be added to a function by defining them inside the parentheses. Unlike before, we don't have to initialize these variables with values. We can configure the value of a variable by updating our function calls. Inside the parentheses of the first function, we will add a different greeting. Notice how I'm not defining a variable. The value we pass into the function will be the value of the variable in the function's parameters. Let's add a different greeting to the second function call. By adding parameters, we can pass data to a function to modify its behavior. In this example, we are trying to output different messages. Let's use our variable. Inside the function, let's replace the current value with the message variable. Lastly, let's view the browser. Awesome! We've got a flexible function to output various messages. Parameters are an optional feature to pass on values to a function. There's one more thing I want to mention before moving on to the next lecture. There's another word you may hear when discussing a function's parameters, which is the word argument. The words parameter and argument can be interchangeable terms. However, there is a difference. A parameter refers to the variable defined in a function's declaration, whereas an argument refers to the value of the variable. Most developers will throw around these words interchangeably. It isn't the end of the world if your phrasing is incorrect. No one's going to scold you for doing so. As long as you understand there's a difference, you should be good to go. Let's move on from functions. In the following lecture, we'll start talking about arrays. In this lecture, we will explore another feature of PHP called arrays. Often, we may need to work with a group or collection of data. For example, a collection of blog posts or users. So far, we've explored storing a single piece of data. What if we need to store multiple pieces of data? One solution would be to create a variable for each piece of data. Unfortunately, that's not a scalable solution. We would need to memorize the names of each variable. Ideally, we should be able to store multiple pieces of data in a single variable. That's what an array is for. Arrays can store an unlimited amount of values. Let's try creating one. Inside our PHP file, let's remove the existing code. Next, let's create a variable called food. The value for this variable will be the word array followed by a pair of parentheses. Arrays can be created with the array function. As we learned, functions are a feature for outsourcing reusable logic. We're not limited to functions defined by us. There are hundreds of functions built into the PHP language to help you perform various tasks. We don't need to do anything to expose these functions to our code. They're automatically available from the beginning. Strangely, the value of the variable is a function. We haven't discussed this feature, but functions can return values. The value returned by the function will be used as the variable's value. In our case, the array function will return an array. Therefore, the food variable will store an array, not a copy of the array function. Inside the function's arguments, we can start adding values. There are a couple of things to keep in mind. We're allowed to store as many values as we'd like. Values must be comma separated. Lastly, the data types do not need to be consistent. We can create an array of strings and numbers. However, it's common practice to store the same type of value within an array. It keeps our code consistent. Let's try adding some of our favorite food. By creating an array, we're able to store a collection of data in a single variable. The next step is to start rendering the data in our array. After creating the array, let's echo the food variable. Individual items in an array can be accessed by typing a pair of square brackets after the array. Inside the brackets, we can type a number to grab an item from an array. Behind the scenes, PHP will assign numeric indexes to each value. In the programming world, it's common for an index to start at 0. So, for example, let's say we want to grab the first item in the array. The index for this item would be 0. What about the second item? The second item would have an index of 1. The third item would have an index of 2. So on and so forth. You get the picture. Inside these square brackets, we can input the index of the item we'd like to grab. Let's grab the first item by typing 0. Before viewing the browser, let's try rendering a different item. Try this as an exercise. I want you to output a different item from the array. Pause the video and good luck. Welcome back. Let's walk through the solution together. After the first echo statement, let's add another. For this example, I will output the last item in the array. The index for this value is 2. Remember to add the number inside these square brackets. Next, let's view the browser. As expected, both values appear on the page. That's fantastic. We have the power to store a collection of values and access them individually. Let's continue our discussion of arrays in the next lecture. In this lecture, we are going to explore a feature called loops. There's one common scenario you will come across in your programming journey. You may want to output the entire collection of an array. Inside our script, there are 3 items in the array. Writing an echo statement for each item is possible, but not scalable. If there were dozens of items, this process would become tedious. What if the array changes? Our echo statements would require constant updates. I don't feel like babysitting our code to correctly output the entire array. Luckily, we can avoid this scenario by using another feature called loops. PHP provides a feature for looping through the contents of an array. We can create a loop by typing the while keyword. Let's replace the echo statements with the while keyword. Next, we can add a pair of parentheses and curly brackets. A while loop is composed of two pieces. The first piece is the condition. Inside the parentheses, we must provide a condition for the loop. A condition will tell PHP to execute the code written inside the curly brackets. As long as the condition is true, the loop will run. I should provide a word of caution. It is possible to create an infinite loop. I highly advise against creating an infinite loop for various reasons. It can eat resources on your machine. Some hosts will even shut down your account if you attempt to create an infinite loop. Our goal is to loop through each item in the array. After the loop has gone through every value, it should stop running. First, we need to keep track of how many times the loop has executed the block of code. Above the loop, create a variable called count with a value of 0. Next, inside the condition, let's add the following: count less than count food. There are a couple of things to note about this condition. Firstly, we're using a function called count. The count function is defined by the PHP language. As its name suggests, it'll count the items in an array. This value is returned by the function. Secondly, we are comparing the count variable with the value returned by the count function. Initially, the count variable will be 0. There are 3 items in the array. Therefore, we can assume the condition will check if 0 is less than 3. This condition is truthy. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to the documentation page for comparison operators. Out of the box, PHP provides dozens of comparison operators. As its name implies, comparison operators will compare two values. In our case, we're comparing if one value is less than another. You can view this table for a complete list of comparison operators. Feel free to play around with different comparison operators after you've finished this lecture. Let's go back to our editors. The condition will always be true. Therefore, we've created an infinite loop. We should update the count variable on each iteration. Inside the curly brackets, let's update the count variable to the count variable plus 1. Let's break down the behavior of the while loop. Initially, PHP will check the condition. If the condition is true, the code inside the block will execute. In our block of code, we're updating the count variable by adding 1. After the code has finished executing, the condition is checked again. This time, the count variable will be set to 1. 1 is less than 3. Therefore, the condition is true. Once again, the block of code will execute. Eventually, the count variable will not be less than 3. Our loop will stop running. This is the most important step. We should always stop our loop from infinitely running. Now that we've established a loop, let's try echoing the values from the array. Before updating the count variable, let's output the food array. Inside the square brackets, let's add the count variable. Instead of writing a raw value, we're using the count variable as the index. Conveniently, the count variable starts at 0. On each iteration, it'll update by 1, which gives us access to the next value in the array. If our theory is correct, we should be able to view all values in the array. Let's check out the browser. Perfect! We've rendered all items in the array. If we remove or add items, the page should be reflected with the changes. Currently, our code is not formatted, but that's alright. As long as all items are displayed on the page, we're good to go. Before I end this lecture, there's a shorthand syntax I want to show you. go back to your editor. PHP has additional features for helping you write less code. Instead of updating the count variable, we can replace the assignment with two plus symbols. Two plus symbols are called the increment operator. They perform the same action as incrementing a number by 1. There isn't a difference between the two solutions. However, most developers prefer this operator because it results in writing less code. Another shorthand syntax you should be aware of is for arrays. Let's replace the array function with square brackets. You don't need to use the array function to create an array. A pair of square brackets will create an array. Once again, either solution works. It's a matter of preference. Some developers prefer the array function because it gives clarity as to the type of value you're creating. We're finished with our discussion of arrays. I'll see you in the next lecture. In this lecture, we are going to explore another way of creating variables. PHP allows us to create constants. A constant is a variable that cannot have its value updated. They're a special type of variable. If we attempt to update a constant after it's been initialized, PHP will throw an error. Constants can be reliable for storing data that never needs to change. We can store strings, numbers, booleans, etc. You may be asking, why would we want to create a constant? It seems like a variation of a variable, but with fewer features. This is true, but it's incredibly beneficial. Firstly, constants are faster than regular variables. PHP does not need to keep track of changes to a variable. Secondly, constants are reliable. Let's say you are calculating the total cost of a purchase. Taxes must be applied. It's unlikely the tax rate may change for a user. It's the perfect scenario for storing the tax rate in a constant. Variables are constantly being passed around. If we were to use a regular variable, the variable might accidentally get updated. By using a constant, we are always guaranteed the value of a variable never changes. For these reasons, constants are considered useful. Enough chit-chat. Let's try creating a constant. In our PHP file, let's remove the previous code. Creating a constant is a completely different process than creating a regular variable. Constants are declared with the define function. The define function has two arguments. The first argument is the name of the variable. For this example, let's call our constant name. There are three things worth mentioning about this argument. Firstly, the name must be passed in as a string. Secondly, the name must adhere to the variable naming rules. For example, spaces are not allowed. Otherwise, we would receive an error. Lastly, the name of the variable is in all caps. Technically, we don't need to use uppercase letters. Constants can have lowercase letters in their names. However, it's common practice to use all uppercase letters. This convention helps identify constants. Throughout your career as a WordPress developer, you're going to notice that this convention is widely adopted. For the rest of this course, we're going to follow this practice. Let's shift our focus to the second argument. The second argument of the define function is the value for the variable. Let's pass in our name. After defining a constant, the value may never change. On the other hand, we are allowed to read the value. For example, let's echo the name constant. A constant's value can be accessed by its name. We don't have to add the $ symbol to the name. We can add the variable solely by its name. In your browser, refresh the page. Perfect. The value of our constant appears on the page. By using constants, we are guaranteed the value never changes. Throughout this course, we will be using a mixture of constants and regular variables. Let's continue our journey in the next lecture. In this lecture, let's briefly talk about errors. Undoubtedly, you're going to run into errors. There are hundreds of possible errors in the PHP world. The best way to tackle errors is to read the message. For the most part, PHP does a decent job of providing basic error info. Let's look at an example. In our PHP file, we have a constant. As I stated before, constants can never be updated. Despite that statement, let's try changing the constant. After defining the name constant, create a second constant with the same name. The value should be different. Next, let's refresh the browser. As expected, an error has been produced. Let's read it together. Warning: constant name already defined in test.php. In my opinion, this is pretty helpful info. Every word helps us understand the issue with our code. Let's dissect the anatomy of an error. First things first, PHP will tell us the type of error. In this example, PHP says the error is a warning. Warnings do not stop the script from running. If there's a problem, PHP will tell you about it but will continue to run the rest of the script. For this reason, the name gets outputted after the error. Afterward, we are provided a description of the error. According to the description, our constant has already been defined. The description is pretty cut and clear. We are attempting to define a constant that's been defined before. The last piece of the error message is the file name and line number of the error. This points us directly to where the error can be found. Let's try removing this line from our file. Lastly, refresh the page. The error has gone away. Perfect. We've successfully debugged our script. It won't always be this simple, but PHP does try to help you whenever it can. You should always carefully read the error to understand why your script is not working. In the next lecture, let's discuss one more feature before moving to WordPress. In this lecture, we will cover one more feature of PHP before moving on to WordPress. It's a very simple feature called comments. PHP comments serve the same purpose as HTML and CSS comments. They are a feature for providing notes and documentation in our code. There are two syntaxes for writing comments. The first syntax is called a single-line comment. Single-line comments are written with 2 / characters. Single-line comments apply to one line. If we attempted to write more text after the comment, it wouldn't be interpreted as a comment. Instead, it'll be interpreted as code, leading to errors. For example, above the define function, let's add a single-line comment. My editor highlights the text as green. Your editor may highlight it differently. Regardless, we've written a comment. Anything goes on this line. Subsequent lines remain unaffected by our comment. In some cases, you may want to write a long comment. Single-line comments aren't suited for this type of action. The second syntax is called a block comment, which allows us to write multiple lines of comments. They're written with / and asterisk characters. Here's an example. Block comments must be opened and closed with the same characters. In between these characters, we can write as much gibberish as we'd like. Some developers like to add an asterisk character on every line. This does not do anything. It's just a style preference. That about does it for comments. It's time to jump into WordPress. See you in the next lecture. In this lecture, let's talk about what's coming next. PHP is a language designed to render dynamic HTML pages. This section has covered the most common features you'll use in WordPress development. If you understood everything thus far, you're well on your way to becoming a professional WordPress developer. Before moving forward, I want to set your expectations. It's entirely possible to create sites without WordPress. After all, WordPress is written with PHP. There's nothing stopping us from creating our own system for generating pages. However, WordPress is not just popular with users but with developers. WordPress introduces a complete suite of APIs for extending its behavior. We can leverage WordPress's system to create the additional features. Therefore, it's not necessary to learn every feature in PHP. WordPress abstracts the complicated technical details. As you'll soon discover, we can tailor WordPress's behavior with a few lines of code. PHP is a complex language with hundreds of features. There's a lot to discover. Despite that, we're going to jump into WordPress. I don't want this course to get too dull. Therefore, I'll be introducing additional PHP features as we work on the master project for this course. If there's something you felt was missing, don't worry. We may cover it in a future lecture. Our PHP journey doesn't end here. I hope you're excited. I know I am. When you're ready, I'll see you in the next section. In this section, we're going to start diving into theme development by working on a master project. This course focuses on developing a large theme and plugin. By doing so, you'll be given first-hand experience on what it takes to develop a large project. We got a taste of PHP in the last section. It's time to see how WordPress uses PHP to power a content management system. First things first, let's check out the files in our editor. Right away, you'll notice there are hundreds of files in WordPress. It can be daunting to decide where to begin. I think the best place to start is with the configuration file. It's one of the most important files in WordPress. At the heart of every WordPress site is the configuration file. Regardless of what you're doing, the configuration file is loaded on every request. Let's take a peek at what's inside. It can be found in the root directory of your WordPress installation. The file is called wp-config.php. The configuration file contains the core settings of WordPress. This information is highly sensitive. We can find info such as the database login credentials, security keys, etc. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to the wp-config documentation page. This page provides documentation for WordPress's configuration file. It contains a comprehensive list of every option available. We're allowed to freely edit the configuration file without our changes being overridden. Updates will not affect the configuration file. We won't be able to cover most of these settings. The default settings are optimized for most WordPress apps. Normally, we would have to configure WordPress. Luckily, Local expedited this process for us. So you may be thinking, why are we starting with this file? As developers, we're inevitably going to be running into problems. It's completely natural. By default, WordPress disables debugging mode. While errors are helpful for developers, they can be incredibly dangerous to show to visitors. If a visitor is malicious, they can use the info from an error to hack our site. It's considered good practice to hide errors in a production environment. In our case, we're in a development environment. For the best possible development experience, we should enable WordPress's debug mode. On the sidebar, there is a link to an option called WP Debug. Let's click on it. According to the documentation, this option will allow errors to appear on the screen. In a production environment, this option should always be set to false. Since we're working locally, we should set this option to true. It's going to help us debug our code if we run into errors. Let's turn it on. Switch back to the editor. Immediately, we're going to be given dozens of lines of code. It can seem intimidating at first, but don't worry. Take a deep breath. If you were to read each line of code one by one, you're going to notice something. This file is filled with comments and constants, nothing you haven't encountered before. WordPress's configuration settings are defined with constants. The comments are to describe each setting. After all, WordPress is an open source project. The developers of the project try their best to keep the code base beginner friendly. Feel free to read through the comments. Let's take a look at the first constant. As we've learned, constants are created with the define function. In addition, constant names are written with all uppercase letters. It's a common practice among WordPress developers. Feel free to explore the constants in this file. You can always refer to the documentation for more info. In the next lecture, we're going to modify this file to help us with debugging WordPress. In this lecture, we are going to refine the configuration file to help us debug WordPress. As we discussed before, WordPress is not configured to help us debug issues. If we want help, we need to enable debug mode. At the moment, I have the wp-config.php file opened. Open it in your editor if you haven't already. The configuration file does not contain all the settings mentioned in the documentation. If an option is missing, WordPress will set a default value. Some settings are completely optional. Scroll to the bottom of the file. It's recommended to add additional configuration settings above this comment. We're going to turn on debug mode. It's the first step we should always take when working on a new project. Let's define a constant called wp-debug with the define function. The value for the constant will be true. Make sure your code matches mine. The words wp-debug should be written with uppercase letters. Just like that, we're ready to start coding. If we make a mistake, we'll be able to view the error. This behavior is great for a development environment. There's another setting worth adding. Below the wp-debug variable, define another constant called wp-disable-fatal-error-handler. The value for this constant should be true. PHP has a special type of error called a fatal error. Fatal errors will cause the server to produce a blank page, which may not be desirable. WordPress has implemented a feature to produce a friendlier page if there's a fatal error in our theme. It's better than viewing a blank page. By default, this setting is turned off. If you would like to enable this behavior, this constant should be set to true. There are dozens of additional settings that we could add. When the time comes, we'll tweak our application's configuration. For now, we're not going to configure WordPress further. The default settings will be suitable for our project. Changing the behavior of WordPress is as simple as changing the values of these constants. We're finished with configuring the wp-config file. Feel free to explore the documentation for more information. For our purposes, setting the wp-debug constant to true is more than enough to get started. There are additional settings that we can add for development, but we'll revisit those settings in future lectures. Let's continue our journey in the following lecture. In this lecture, we're going to explore the files and folders from WordPress. After doing so, it'll become clear where we can begin. This lecture is meant to give a general overview of WordPress's structure. We're going to start with the files in the root directory. The files in the root directory contain code for preparing WordPress. WordPress needs to go through a few phases before delivering a page to the user. These files are responsible for delivering the pages on the front side of WordPress. There's not much else to say about these files. We'll never have to worry about them. Next, let's explore the three directories in our project. There are three folders called wp-admin, wp-content, and wp-includes. Let's start with the wp-includes folder. WordPress defines hundreds of functions. You can find most of them inside this folder. We should distinguish between the files inside this folder and the files in the root directory of the project. The files in the root directory are responsible for loading a page on the browser, whereas the files inside the wp-includes folder contains function definitions that WordPress uses to process data. Many of the files inside this folder can't do anything by themselves. They do not render pages. If you attempt to view these files in the browser, it's likely you won't see anything. Moving on, the next directory is called wp-admin. This folder contains code for the WordPress admin dashboard. WordPress will separate the code for loading a landing page and the admin dashboard. There isn't a reason for every user to load the same code as an administrator. The last folder is the WP content folder. Plugins, themes, and media files can be found inside this directory. We'll be working inside this directory for the majority of the course. If you search through this directory, you will find a few plugins and themes. Feel free to check them out. They're a great way of learning how other developers tackle themes and plugins. I highly don't recommend editing files outside this directory. WordPress may override your changes. The exception to this rule is the wp-config.php file. As you can imagine, we're going to be working inside this directory to develop a WordPress theme and plugin. In the next lecture, we're going to begin developing a theme in the Themes directory. In this lecture, we're going to begin our journey by creating a theme. The question is, where do we start with creating a theme? The first step is to register a theme with WordPress. WordPress has a few requirements for registering a theme. Before getting started, I want to make one point clear. This course is not focused on the HTML and CSS code. We're primarily going to be focusing on PHP and JavaScript. Be sure you're confident with your HTML and CSS skills before proceeding. In the resource section of this lecture, you will find a zip file. It contains the template we'll be using for this course. I want you to download it. I've done nothing to this template that makes it WordPress ready. I will walk you through every step to convert it from a static template into a WordPress theme. The template we'll be using is built with Tailwind. WordPress is ultimately front-end agnostic. We're not required to use a specific framework. We have complete freedom over which libraries are incorporated into our theme. With that being said, Tailwind is one of the simplest libraries to use in a WordPress theme. The template I've provided is very basic. We'll learn about the template as the course progresses. Let's view one of the pages. Currently, I have a home page opened in my browser. If you were to view the other templates, they would look similar to this page. By the end of this course, every feature on this page will be functional. Most importantly, users will be able to customize our theme. For example, the links in the header will be customizable. Users will be able to swap our links with their links. The overall structure of the page is simple. We have a header, footer, sidebar, and an area for the main content of the page. The main content area will be different from page to page. It's a simple design, but don't let that fool you. We're going to be performing a lot of work to get this theme fully functional. My main goal is to help you understand how themes are built. Now that we have an idea of what we're going to create, it's time to start coding. Open the text editor of your choice. It should be pointed to our WordPress project. If you haven't already, start the server. For the rest of this course, you should always have the server running. In our editors, open the wp-content/themes directory. By default, every WordPress installation will come with a couple of themes. In every case, one theme must be present and active. WordPress will always search for your themes in the themes directory. Our themes must live in this directory. Otherwise, WordPress will not be able to detect our theme. For organization reasons, we should separate our theme from other themes by creating a folder. In this directory, create a folder called Udemy. The name of our folder should be unique. We don't want our theme to conflict with other themes. Inside this folder, we're going to create two files. They'll be called style.css and index.php. WordPress has 3 requirements for registering a new theme. Let's talk about those requirements. The first 2 requirements are to create a set of 2 files called style.css and index.php. These files must always be defined inside a theme folder. Otherwise, WordPress will not be able to register your theme. The file names are very important. Our themes must always have these files. We've accomplished 2 out of 3 requirements. The third requirement is a file header. File headers are pieces of additional information for describing your theme. WordPress doesn't know the name of our theme. It doesn't know who the author is. This information is not just important for WordPress, but to our clients as well. We can provide this information by adding a file header. Let's try creating a file header. File headers must be defined in the style.css file. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to the main style sheet documentation page. This page documents what the style.css file is for. If we scroll down, we'll come across a code snippet of what we can insert into this file. At the top of the file, we must insert a block comment. This block comment is what's called a file header. It's a block comment of information about our theme. Every piece of information follows a key value format. The format is the name of the property followed by the value. They're separated with a colon. Below this code snippet, we'll come across a description of every property available. A lot of this information is optional. You don't have to include every piece. The most important property is the name of the theme. Let's copy the example from the documentation. Next, paste it into the style.css file. Let's run down the list of settings. A file header can be created by adding a block comment in CSS. The block comment must be created at the top of the style.css file. WordPress will scan this file for the comment block. The first piece of information we should provide is the name of the theme. The name can be added by adding the theme name property. Let's set the name to Udemy. Believe it or not, we've created our first theme. The name is the only thing that WordPress needs. Everything else is optional. Let's test if this is true. I'm going to remove the other properties in this comment. Next, let's switch over to the admin dashboard in our browsers. We can view the list of themes uploaded to our site by navigating to Appearance, Themes. An empty block with the name of our theme will appear. We can click on this block to view more information. Since we only provided the theme's name, WordPress will not be able to give the user more information. Despite that, our theme is considered valid. We can even activate our theme. Let's give that a try. After a few moments, our theme is active. WordPress has not thrown an error at us. We can even view the theme on the front end. Let's switch over to the main site. The page is going to be empty. It's not because of an error. It's because we haven't created a template. We'll talk about how to create a template in another lecture. We've successfully created our first theme. These are the 3 minimum requirements for creating an official theme. We need to create 2 files called style.css and index.php. The style.css file must contain a file header with the theme's name. After completing those steps, WordPress will recognize our theme. It will not ask for anything else. The information stored in the file header is extracted and presented to the user on the dashboard. As you can see, we didn't need to write additional code to get this feature. WordPress helps us a lot with theme development. This allows us to focus on our theme. Our theme is ready. It's not much, but it's a start. In the next lecture, let's explore the other file headers. In this lecture, we're going to add more headers to the style.css file. Technically, we could move on to adding the template. However, we should be professional. I don't think it would be a good look to only have the name appear on WordPress. We should add more information. Let's switch over to our editors. We're going to continue working inside the style.css file. Before you move further, I recommend pointing your editor to the Udemy theme folder. I've already done that before starting this lecture. We're not going to need to view the other files in WordPress. Our focus will be on the theme for the rest of this section. Pause the video if you need to. Once you've got that done, let's begin adding file headers. Inside the style.css file, we're going to add another property called theme URI. The value for this property should be the URL for the theme. Normally, developers will point to a URL where the theme can be downloaded or bought. We're not going to be selling this theme. Therefore, we'll set the URL to udemy.com. Up next, we need to provide the name of the author with the author property. The author is the creator of the theme. If you're on a team, you may put the name of your team. I'm going to set this option to Udemy. Afterward, we have the author URI property. This property should be set to the author's site. I'm going to set this property to the following URL, https://udemy.com. Let's add a description by adding a property called description. The description for your theme should be short and concise. I'll write the following description of our theme, a simple WordPress theme. The next property is called tags. We have the option of uploading our theme to the official repository of themes on WordPress. We can help users find our theme by defining a list of tags. Tags are words or phrases we can associate with our theme. Each tag is separated with a comma. If you plan on uploading your theme to WordPress.org, this piece of information is important. We won't be uploading this theme to WordPress. It's safe to exclude this header property. Moving along, the version property is the current version of this theme. This option should be regularly updated whenever your theme receives updates. We're creating a brand new theme. The version number will be set to 1.0. Next, we have the requires at least property. We're allowed to set the minimum WordPress version. You may want to set this option if your theme requires newer features of WordPress. If someone attempts to install our theme with an incompatible version of WordPress, an error will be thrown at them. We'll leave this option at 5.9. Subsequently, we have the tested up to property. This option will let the user know which version of WordPress the theme was tested on. We should always set this property to the latest version. It'll assure users the theme is compatible with the latest version of WordPress. We're going to set this option to the current version of WordPress we have installed in our environment. You can refer to local for the current version. Up next, we have the requires PHP property. As we've learned, WordPress is compatible with older versions of PHP, such as version 5.6. This property should be set to the minimum PHP version required for a theme to be functional. Everything we write will be compatible with versions 8 and up. WordPress will throw an error if the theme is installed on an older version of PHP. The next two properties are called license and license URI. It's optional to add these properties. Typically, developers will use the GNU license, which is the same license used by WordPress. I recommend consulting with a lawyer for the best possible license for your theme. There's a lot of information online about licenses. Since we're not going to be making this theme public, we are not going to add these file headers. The last property is called text domain. The text domain is very important in regards to translations. You can think of the text domain as a unique ID for our translations. It's common practice to set the text domain to the same name as your folder. In our case, we're going to set it to Udemy. Translating a theme and plugin is a topic we'll cover in a separate section. Don't worry if you don't fully understand what this setting is for. The first step for translating a theme is to set the text domain property in the file header. It'll help WordPress identify our translations. That does it for the file header. After the file header, we have complete liberty to add additional information. WordPress will not grab this information. You can write gibberish if you'd like. Typically, developers like to add notes for other devs who might need to extend the theme. WordPress will not bother scanning this part of the file. We're finished. Let's refresh the admin dashboard. We can click on the theme again. This time, WordPress is displaying the information from our file header. It was able to scan the style.css file, extract information, and display it. As you can tell so far, WordPress handles a lot for us. There's one last thing I want to do before I end this lecture. While not required, WordPress will search for a file called screenshot.png. The image should provide a preview of your theme. Alternatively, you can display the name of the theme. It's completely up to you. In the resource section, I provide a screenshot you can use for our theme. Download it. After downloading the image, let's upload it to the Udemy theme directory. Lastly, refresh the page. The box for the theme will show the image. Perfect! The image should be a screenshot of your theme, but an image with a logo works too. The recommended dimensions of your image should be 1200 by 900. It's the recommended size by WordPress. The name of the file should be called screenshot.png. Let's recap what we've learned. WordPress will retrieve a list of themes installed in our app. Themes must be defined in the WP content/themes folder. Each theme should have its own folder. WordPress will search for a file called style.css. It'll scan and extract the contents of the file. The information in the header will be presented to the user. That's about it. In the next lecture, we'll continue developing our theme. In this lecture, I want to take a moment to talk about full site editing. For over a year, WordPress has teased a different way of building themes. The time has finally come. In WordPress 5.9, full site editing was introduced into the core. It completely changes how sites are designed and developed. To understand why full site editing was introduced as a feature, we need to wind the clocks back. Prior to full site editing, we had classic site editing for modifying the appearance of a site. Classic site editing is a term used to describe the suite of tools for modifying WordPress. Primarily, we had two tools called the Customizer and a WYSIWYG editor. While they're simple, they're not great for designing a site. It's difficult to design an interface that allows users to modify elements on a page. Both tools could not meet the demands of regular and technical users. For that reason, page builders were introduced into the WordPress ecosystem. In fact, they're so popular it's become a multi-million-dollar industry. Beaver Builder, Divi, Elementor, Visual Composer, and Oxygen are some examples. One of the benefits of using a page builder is the low barrier to entry. It's possible to create a beautiful site with minimal knowledge of HTML and CSS. This can be great for clients. Unfortunately, page builders have their downsides. Firstly, they're expensive. Secondly, you need to deal with managing licenses. Lastly, there isn't a unified standard for building pages. Every page builder approaches things differently. Once you pick a page builder, you're locked in. The team behind WordPress decided to introduce a better editing experience to the core by creating Gutenberg. Originally, Gutenberg could only be used for editing posts. The team fully realized that Gutenberg could transcend its original purpose to being a page builder, hence the idea of full site editing. By adding full site editing, every corner of a template is editable. You can build headers, footers, sidebars, and content areas with blocks. Best of all, it addresses the issues present in modern-day page builders. Firstly, it's free. No need to open your wallet for anybody. Secondly, you don't need to manage licenses. Lastly, it introduces a standard for building pages. That's just the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot to explore with the page builder. However, I would be lying if I said everything is sunshine and roses. There are downsides to full site editing. The main drawback of full site editing is the development experience. Unfortunately, we've received the short end of the stick. WordPress development was known to be easy. You could create a custom theme and plugin within hours. Things have changed. The requirements for developing custom themes and plugins have risen. Typically, you could get away with PHP. However, Gutenberg development requires knowledge of JavaScript and React. The learning curve has gotten steeper. But hey, that's why you're taking this course. We are going to fully embrace full site editing. Love it or hate it, full site editing is the way to go. With that said, let's get into full site editing. I'll see you in the next lecture. In this lecture, we're going to work on the index template. So far, we've been focused on the style.css file. The job of the CSS file is to store information on our theme. Let's shift our focus to the index.php file. It's the second file required by WordPress for officially registering a theme. The purpose of the index template is to display content. If we look at the front side of our site, it'll be completely empty. It's because the index template is blank. Let's open the index.php file in our theme. We have complete freedom over the content of this file. We can add whatever we want. Whatever gets added will be displayed on the site. For example, let's add a pair of h1 tags with some dummy content. Next, let's refresh the page in the browser. The content from the index template appears on the page. WordPress will automatically load this file for us. It's part of the template system. WordPress does not inject anything into our template. We can prove this by viewing the source of the page. As you can see, WordPress has responded with the contents of our file. Thus, we are given complete liberty with the appearance of the page. At the moment, we are using the old system for creating a template. The new system completely relies on blocks. Let's switch to the new system. Switch back to your editor. Switching over to the new system is super easy. There are 2 steps for enabling full site editing. The first step is to create a directory called templates in our theme folder. The name of the folder must be called templates. The second step is to create a file called index.html. This file must be placed inside the templates directory. That's it. We've fully transitioned from classic site editing to full site editing. Let's test our site in the browser. Before refreshing the home page, I want you to take a guess. Which template do you think will be rendered on the page? Let's find out. The behavior has completely changed. Unlike before, WordPress will inject the admin bar at the top of the page. If you don't see the admin bar, you're likely not logged in as an administrator. As for the content of the page, WordPress informs us that the template is empty. The index.php file gets completely ignored. It doesn't matter if you have content inside it. WordPress will always check if your theme has a templates directory. If it does, it'll check if an index.html file exists. Our HTML file has priority over the PHP file. Let's try adding some content. At first, you may be tempted to write plain HTML in our index template. However, this is not a good idea. It can break a theme. To better understand, let's look at a demonstration. Back in your editor, add a pair of h1 tags inside the HTML file. The contents of the tag can be anything. Next, let's refresh the page. Perfect, right? It doesn't seem like WordPress has a problem with plain HTML. Not so fast. While the template is functional on the front end, the same can't be said for the editor. At the top of the page, a button says Edit Site. Click on it. After a few moments, WordPress will load the full site editor for the index template. To be clear, the editor is grabbing the HTML file, not the PHP file. WordPress is telling us that the template is broken. Full site editing is very strict. It does not support plain HTML. Instead, it supports blocks. Templates may contain only blocks. Otherwise, WordPress will be unable to process our templates in the editor. Let's try fixing our template. Back in the editor, remove the h1 tag. Next, add an HTML comment with the following code: wp:/site title/. Under the hood, blocks are written with HTML comments. Inside a comment, we must write the name of the block. As for the slash character, this character indicates the block is self-closing. Don't worry about the details. Once we get into block development, the anatomy of a block will make much more sense. Let's try refreshing the page in the admin dashboard. Unlike before, the editor can understand our template. It has detected that we're using a block called site title. This block will render the name of our site as a clickable link. Next, let's try refreshing the front end. Same as before, WordPress was able to render the block. Despite being an HTML comment, WordPress handled processing and rendering the page. Admittedly, it is very abstract. However, this feature makes it incredibly easy to build templates. As you can already imagine, building a site involves converting a regular HTML file into blocks. That's what we're going to do. First, we're going to try building our site with WordPress's default blocks. Eventually, we will run into a few roadblocks because our UI will be too complex. Once you start running into problems, it's recommended that you create custom blocks. It's going to be a long but worthwhile process. Let's continue our discussion of templates in the next lecture. In this lecture, we are going to replicate the HTML file with PHP. It's not required, but it's a great opportunity to learn what's happening behind the scenes. Let me show you what I mean. On the home page, I'm going to view the page's source. Do you remember the last time we viewed this page? The contents of the index.php file was returned by WordPress. This time, WordPress has returned dozens of tags and classes. By using full site editing, WordPress will help us with some basic starter content that is required for a fully functioning theme. Prior to full site editing, we would be writing every single line of code to produce this template. Rather than waste time, this process has been expedited for us, which is great. But what's happening behind the scenes? How is WordPress generating those extra HTML tags? Why is it generating additional content? It's not bloated code, I promise. The content produced by WordPress is very important. To give you a better idea, this is the code WordPress uses to generate our page. Initially, it may seem intimidating, but I promise it's not. We have two options at our disposal. We can proceed to work on our theme, or we can study the template produced by WordPress. In my opinion, studying the template is the best option for two reasons. Firstly, it allows us to practice PHP. Secondly, it gives us insight into how WordPress builds pages. This information might come in handy for extending the base templates. It'll make more sense as you progress through the course. For those reasons, we will recreate the base template that surrounds the index.html file. The code is going to look exactly the same as this image. To get started, we'll need to switch back to classic site editing. In the templates directory, let's rename the index.html file to something random. The file name doesn't matter. As long as it's not called index.html, we're good to go. If WordPress can't find an index.html file, it'll fall back to the index.php file. We're going back to classic site editing so that we can start from scratch. Once we've got a good grip on the technical details, we'll switch back to full site editing. In the following lecture, let's get started with recreating the index template. In this lecture, we are going to start recreating the index template by adding the language attribute. Oftentimes, it can be an easily overlooked attribute. However, it can mean a difference in the popularity of your themes. Let's try adding it. In your editor, open the index.php file. Let's replace the contents of the file with a standard HTML template. If you're using Visual Studio Code, a template can be quickly generated with one line of code. Inside the editor, type HTML:5. As you do so, your editor will recommend a template. Pressing the Enter key will generate an HTML template. Voila! We've got a basic starter template. Nothing in this template should be new to you. Let's shift our focus to the opening HTML tag. On this tag, a language attribute has been added. The purpose of the language attribute is to help the browser identify the language. By doing so, search engines can correctly index a site. In addition, screen readers will be able to pick the correct language profile for reading a site. Lastly, the common use case of the language attribute is to modify the styles of a document based on the language. Let's look at an example. In the body tag, add a paragraph tag with dummy text. Next, let's add a style tag to the head section of the document. Dozens of languages are read from left to right. However, there are languages written from right to left. Arabic is an example. If our theme is active on an Arabic site, we should change the direction of our text. We can check the language of a document by adding the language selector. Inside the parentheses, we can specify the language by typing a language code. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to a list of valid language codes. Language codes are preferred over full names. This is because languages can be spelled differently from country to country. Language codes provide a standardized value for each language. The language code for Arabic is AR. Let's head back to our editors. Inside these parentheses, add in the language code. Next, let's change the direction by adding the direction property with a value of RTL. Essentially, we're telling the browser to change the text's direction if the document's language is Arabic. For demonstration purposes, let's update the language attribute to AR. In your browser, refresh the page. On the page, the text of our paragraph appears on the right side of the document. As theme developers, our themes should be compatible with various languages. It's common for sites to be multilingual. Hard-coding the value of the language attribute is considered bad practice. The question is, how do we generate an appropriate value for this attribute? WordPress has got our back. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to a function called language attributes. As its name suggests, this function will grab the language of the current WordPress installation. If a site is using French, it'll set the language attribute to French. Let's give it a try. Switch back to your editor. Next, replace the language attribute with a pair of PHP tags. Previously, I stated that HTML couldn't be written within PHP tags. However, the same is not true for vice versa. It's perfectly acceptable to add PHP tags inside an HTML tag. This is how WordPress recommends that we use this function. Inside the PHP tags, let's call the language attributes function. Interestingly, this function is not defined in our file. By registering and activating a theme, WordPress will automatically define this function for you. This is true for most WordPress functions. We don't need to do anything to start using this function. Let's refresh the page. The text has been positioned to the left. Personally, the current language of my site is set to English. We can verify the attribute has been generated by opening the developer tools. Under the Elements panel, the browser will show the document. If we look at the HTML tag, the language attribute has been added. The language attributes function was able to check the current configuration of our site. It was able to add this attribute on our behalf with the correct language. As a fun experiment, you can try changing the language of your site to test the behavior. The language code should change accordingly. Super easy, right? WordPress has a series of functions for performing the most common tasks. For this reason, developers love WordPress. A lot of the complexities are abstracted away from us. That about does it for the language attribute. Before moving on, let's remove the style block from our document. It's not necessary to keep it around. I added it in for demonstration purposes. After you've removed the style block, I'll see you in the next lecture. In this lecture, we will modify the character set of our document. Similar to before, the character set should be dynamic. Luckily, WordPress stores the character set for a site in its database. The goal is to grab this information and render it in the browser. As always, WordPress has a function for addressing this specific problem. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to a function called blog info. The blog info function can retrieve data from the database. It is limited, but it can grab the character set. To better understand, let's read the documentation together. The best skill you can pick up as a developer is to learn how to read the documentation. According to the description, the function will display information about the current site. The most useful section is the parameters section. The parameters section will provide a list of values we can pass into a function. In this example, the blog info function has a parameter called show. The show parameter allows us to specify the type of value to display on the page. We'll find more information under the More Information section. WordPress will provide a complete list of values that we can pass into the function. Different values will be rendered based on the value passed in. If we look through the list, we'll come across an option for grabbing the character set called char set. Perfect! It's exactly what we were looking for. Let's give it a try. In your editor, open the index.php file. The meta tag for adding the character set is already in our template. The blog info function will output the value but not the entire meta tag. Therefore, we need to write the function inside the character set attribute. Replace the value with PHP tags. Next, call the blog info function. Lastly, we can pass in a string to the function. The character set can be retrieved by passing in a string called char set. Time to test our code. In your browser, refresh the page. We can verify the character set has been added by viewing the Elements panel in the Developer Tools. Search for the meta tag in the head tag. As expected, the character set has been correctly configured. In most cases, the character set should be UTF-8. It accepts a wide range of characters. Let's continue working on our template in the next lecture. In this lecture, we are going to start loading additional tags in our document. We're not the only ones that need to add tags. The WordPress core and third-party plugins may want to add meta tags, load style sheets, and load scripts. By default, WordPress does not inject tags into our template. We need to provide a location for safely loading additional tags. Once again, WordPress has a function for tackling this problem. In your editor, open the index.php file. Below the meta tag, run a PHP function called wp-head. The wp-head function will allow WordPress and plugins to load tags into the head section of our document. I highly recommend calling the wp-head function after adding your own tags. A themes tag should take priority over tags from third-party plugins. In most cases, developers will call the wp-head function at the end of the head tag. We're not finished yet. Some plugins may want to load scripts. It's recommended that we load script files at the bottom of the document. Similar to before, WordPress does not automatically inject scripts into our document. We need to provide a location for loading scripts. Before the closing body tag, run a function called wp-footer. The wp-footer function performs a similar operation as the wp-head function. It'll allow plugins to begin loading scripts into the document. We haven't had the chance to jump into JavaScript. For now, it's enough to understand that we're providing a location for plugins to load additional tags and files. Let's try loading our theme in the browser. After making those changes, WordPress has loaded the admin bar. If you don't see the admin bar, it's likely that you're not logged in as an admin. Regardless, WordPress will still inject tags into our document. Open the Elements panel in the Developer Tools. Our document looks vastly different than before. WordPress has injected several tags into the head and body sections of our document, which is great. Our theme is starting to become extendable. If a plugin needs to load additional tags, it'll be able to without a problem. We're getting close to finishing the template. In the next lecture, let's wrap it up. In this lecture, we're going to finalize the template by covering 2 more functions related to the body tag. WordPress does a lot to help us with creating a theme. Another helpful feature is generating a set of classes for the body tag. It's going to be incredibly helpful for styling pages. Let's look at why that is. In your editor, open the index.php template. On the body tag, run a function called bodyClass. In some cases, you may want to add classes to the body tag. The bodyClass function has an optional parameter, which is a list of classes. These classes will be added alongside the classes generated by WordPress. For example purposes, let's try adding a class called Example. We have the option of passing in a string of classes or an array of strings. To keep it simple, refresh the page with the Developer Tools open. Under the Elements panel, the body tag will contain a series of classes. They aren't random. These classes will tell you information about the page and user. For example, there's a class called Admin, which only appears if the current user is an administrator. There's another class called Home. If the user is viewing the home page, this class gets added. Lastly, our example class has been added to the list. There are dozens of classes that can be generated. Let's look at another page. With every installation of WordPress, a sample post is added. Navigate to the Posts page in the Admin dashboard. Next, try viewing the post on the front end. This time, an entirely different set of classes has been added. Whenever we're viewing a single post, the single post class gets added. As you can see, WordPress will help you stylize your pages with a series of classes. You don't have to use them, but they are there. Even if you don't plan on using them, there may be plugins that need them. Better safe than sorry. Let's move on to one more function. Switch back to the template. WordPress has one more function for loading tags at the beginning of the body tag. There are 2 functions for injecting tags into the body tag. As we've learned, the first tag is called WP Footer. The second function is called WP Body Open. Let's run this function after the opening body tag. These functions may seem redundant, but there is a difference between them. The WP Footer function allows plugins to load content at the bottom of the document, whereas the WP Body Open function allows plugins to load content at the beginning of the document. Between these functions, we should load our theme's content. With that final function in place, our template is complete. We've successfully recreated the template. Creating this template was not necessary. However, it was a great opportunity for learning WordPress's default behavior with full site editing. Let's switch back to full site editing by changing the file name of our HTML file. As a reminder, the name of the file should be called index.html. One more test. In the browser, refresh the page. WordPress has switched back to full site editing. Behind the scenes, WordPress will execute the exact same functions we've called in the index.php file. In the PHP file, we can safely leave the file empty. For educational purposes, I'm going to leave the file as is. However, for your themes, this file should always be empty. In this lecture, let's take a moment to explore the various resources at our disposal for WordPress development. Throughout this course, I've been throwing links at you for various functions. In my opinion, WordPress is very well documented. However, it is very large. Being able to navigate the documentation will help you with your journey as a developer. You can follow along with me by checking out the links in the resource section of this lecture. First things first, we should make a distinction between the two sites. If we were to search for WordPress, two results would appear, which are WordPress.com and WordPress.org. They have similar domain names, but there's one huge distinction between them. The .com domain is a hosting platform for WordPress. After we're finished developing a WordPress site, the next step is to upload our code to a hosting provider. There are dozens of providers available that exclusively deal with WordPress sites. The WordPress.com hosting platform is just one of the many hosts available. It's completely optional to upload your code to this platform. Let's keep moving forward. The .org domain does not host sites. Instead, it'll host the original source code of WordPress. It's the same code you'll find in the app/public directory of our local installation. WordPress is 100% open source. There are no fees associated with downloading WordPress. We can download WordPress, read the code, and modify it. If you're interested in downloading the source code of WordPress, you can do so at the .org domain. Throughout this course, we're going to be spending most of our time on this site. Let's keep exploring. Under Support, click Documentation. This part of the site will provide documentation on WordPress's features. This documentation will go over the basics of WordPress, such as installation and configuration. It's aimed at individuals who don't know how to code. The technical details of WordPress are not documented on this part of the site. WordPress documents the technical details elsewhere. Scroll to the bottom of the page. On the footer, there's a link for developers. Let's click on it. The developer site is aimed at programmers. It's going to be your most valuable resource as a developer. Before digging deeper, there's another resource worth mentioning. It's called Codex. The Codex was the original place for WordPress documentation. Back in the early days, WordPress used the Codex resource for everything, from code examples to simple explanations about the user system. However, as WordPress grew, the documentation became bloated with information. It was difficult to navigate for technical and non-technical users. As a result, they've separated the developer and user-friendly documentation. The Codex resource is no longer supported. In a few years, it'll be completely removed. From time to time, the Codex resource contains code examples. The WordPress team has not completed the transition from the Codex resource to the developer resource. It's a work in progress. In almost all instances, you'll want to refer to the documentation on the developer resource. The Codex resource will eventually be retired. The developer resource is kept up to date with the latest changes in WordPress. Let's learn how to take advantage of this resource. The main page of the developer resource will contain links to different topics of WordPress. For example, if we want to learn about themes, we can click on the Themes section. We'll be exploring these topics throughout this course. Most sections will take you to a handbook to learn the basics of each feature. The most important section is the Code Reference section. Let's check it out. The Code Reference section allows us to search through WordPress's codebase. Below the search form, there's a quick overview of the changes made to the WordPress core. This is a really great way to check out what functions have been added. On the right, there's a list of APIs available in WordPress. We'll be exploring most of these functions throughout the course. Let's take a look at how to search for code. You don't need to follow along for this part. You can sit back and relax. In the search form, let's try searching for the blog info function. This is one of the functions we've learned about. The reference will return a few results. Let's check out the first result. WordPress does an incredible job of documenting its functions. If we're interested in learning about a specific piece of code, we'll be able to search for it through the code reference. This page will document everything you'd like to know about the function. Let's run through it together. We've already reviewed the description, parameters, and more information sections. These sections are self-explanatory. The next section of this page is called Source. The Source section documents the original function definition. WordPress is completely transparent with its codebase. You can study WordPress's functions for a better understanding of its behavior. WordPress will even give you the file name. Down further, there's another section called Related. WordPress functions are not just used by us, but by other WordPress functions. Sometimes the documentation may not give enough information. In those cases, seeing how WordPress uses its functions may provide clarity. You'll find some great examples by reading through the WordPress code. Next is the changelog section. This section will document the changes made to a function. As you can see, this function definition has been around since version 0.71. As I stated previously, WordPress is a popular choice because most code you write will be comparable with earlier versions. Not as early as this version, but you shouldn't have any problems with a few versions back. The last section is the User Contributed Notes section. This section allows for other developers to share additional tips about this function. It's a great way to see how other developers tackle problems in WordPress. As you can see, the developer resource is incredibly handy. Be warned, not all pages are like this. Some pages are not as documented as well as the blog info function. Luckily, the most commonly used features are well documented. I know this lecture is introducing a lot of resources. As time goes on, we will get a lot of practice with how we can use these resources for developing plugins and themes. To reiterate, the developer resource provides information pertaining to the code of WordPress. A lot of this information is technical and aimed at developers. Before ending this lecture, let's explore a site called Automatic. Automatic is a company that makes huge contributions to the WordPress software. They own plugins such as Jetpack and WooCommerce. They don't own WordPress. However, they have significant influence over the open source project. Automatic owns the .com domain of WordPress, but they do not own WordPress itself. It is very important to make that distinction. Anyway, that's about it. Let's continue our journey in the next lecture. In this lecture, we're going to discuss WordPress's coding standards. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to the WordPress Best Practices page. We're going to be writing a lot of code. Along the journey, we should adhere to certain practices. If we're on a team, it can be annoying if everyone writes code differently. Code should be consistent across the board. WordPress outlines some guidelines for how you should write and format your code. On this page, there are guidelines for different languages. We should follow these guidelines to the best of our abilities. Keep in mind that these are recommendations. You're not forced to write your code in a specific way. If you want to, you can completely ignore these recommendations. However, adhering to a standard will provide the best experience for everyone. If you plan on contributing to the core of WordPress, you must follow these guidelines. If you plan on releasing plugins and themes independently, these guidelines are optional. I'm going to click on the PHP Coding Standards link. You're more than free to review these standards. Don't worry if it doesn't make complete sense. Throughout this course, I will try my best to adhere to these standards. As long as you follow along with me, you should be fine. Let's begin coding themes in the next section. Welcome to your first aside. An aside is an optional lecture. The purpose of these lectures is to review a programming feature. If you're an experienced programmer, you can skip these lectures. Otherwise, let's get into it. For this lecture, we are going to learn about JSON. It's going to become relevant in an upcoming lecture. So, what is JSON? JSON is a format for reading and writing data. It's short for JavaScript Object Notation. As its name suggests, JSON was heavily inspired by JavaScript. However, you are not required to know JavaScript to learn JSON. There are plenty of developers who learn JSON without learning JavaScript. The reason is simple. JSON is considered incredibly easy to learn. Unlike other languages, JSON does not have features like functions, loops, or complex logic. That's not the purpose of using JSON. The main goal of JSON is to store data, plain and simple. Why would we want a language dedicated to storing data? That's a good question. There are various programming languages. Nowadays, developing an application with multiple programming languages is not uncommon. This poses a problem. What if we want to share data between languages? We need a format that each language can read. That's where JSON jumps into the picture. Almost all languages can read and write JSON. As we've learned, WordPress is written with PHP and JavaScript. These are two different programming languages. In some cases, we need to communicate between both languages. JSON is the preferred format for sending and receiving data. Like most languages, various data types are supported. We can store strings, numbers, booleans, arrays, and objects. We haven't had the opportunity to review the object data type. Let's talk about it during our discussion of JSON. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to a playground for JSON. This playground will help us validate our JSON code. To get started with JSON, we need to add a pair of curly brackets. You can think of these curly brackets as a container for your data. More on that later. Next, let's begin adding some data. The format for adding data is similar to creating a file header. JSON follows a key value format. There are some crucial differences. Firstly, the key must be wrapped with double quotes. For our first key, let's try adding a property called name. Key value pairs are separated with a colon. As for the value, our name can be considered a string. Just like PHP, strings are created with double quotes. Single quotes are not supported. If we were to use single quotes, the playground would throw an error. Always use double quotes. Let's add our name. Pretty simple, right? Let's keep playing around with the other data types. New values can be added by separating them with commas. Putting new values on new lines is recommended. Technically, you could put everything into a single line. However, your code may be difficult to read. Let's add a property called age. Numbers can be added as is. Our example is a whole number, but decimal values are supported too. Let's move on to booleans. The next example will be called is hungry with a value of true. Booleans can be true or false. Keep in mind, the property name must always be in double quotes. The data type does not impact the naming of the property. Secondly, spaces are not allowed. We are restricted to alphanumeric characters and underscores. There are two more data types. The next data type is an array. Arrays allow us to store a collection of values within a single property. Let's add an array called hobbies. Arrays are created with square brackets. Inside these brackets, we can add a series of values separated by a comma. I'm going to add some hobbies. The final data type is an object. They're very similar to an array. An object is a data type for storing a group of data. In some cases, data may be related to one another. An object may sound similar to an array, but there's one distinction between objects and arrays. Unlike arrays, an object's values must be key value pairs. Let's look at an example by adding a property called job. The syntax for creating an object is a pair of curly brackets. Hold on a moment. Does this mean our entire file is an object? You'd be correct with that assessment. We've been creating an object all along. Array values are referenced through their index. As we've learned, arrays are zero-based. In our hobbies array, we can grab the first item of the array with the number 0. Objects are different. We can grab a value by the name of the key. For example, if we want the name, we can grab it by typing name. Interestingly, we are allowed to nest objects inside an object. These features allow us to organize our data. In this example, we're going to store data related to our job. Inside the object, I'll add a key called company. The value will be Udemy. Just like that, we've created our first JSON file. There's not much else to say about JSON. In upcoming lectures, we are going to start writing JSON for configuring our theme. There are going to be plenty of opportunities to get practice. Feel free to experiment with the playground. For convenience, the playground will recommend some examples. You can click on these examples to view different combinations of data. Once you're finished playing with JSON, I'll see you in the next lecture. In this lecture, we are going to start extending the full site editor by adding global styles. Global styles are a beta feature. It's getting closer to coming out of beta. The idea is to allow users to modify a site's styles on a global level. Let's look at an example. In your browser, navigate to the WordPress dashboard. On the sidebar, navigate to Appearance, Editor. This link will bring us to the full site editor. At the top right corner, there's going to be a button called Styles. If you click on it, the Global Styles sidebar will pop up. Initially, the sidebar will allow us to modify the typography and colors of a theme. For example, let's try changing the color of the background. The changes are going to apply on a global level. As you can see, the entire page has changed its background color. I'm going to clear this change. We can fine-tune our changes to specific blocks. For example, I'm going to add additional paragraphs to the template. Next, I'll head back to the initial section of the sidebar. Towards the bottom of the sidebar, there's going to be an option for manipulating a specific set of blocks. WordPress will provide a list of blocks that can be modified as a group. Let's try modifying the paragraph block by changing the background color. By changing the background color, all paragraph blocks are affected. Global styles are a very powerful feature. They empower users to modify the appearance of a theme without programming knowledge. While convenient, you may want to extend or restrict this behavior. Luckily, WordPress doesn't leave us powerless. Theme developers can extend the global styles with a single file. Let's switch over to our editor. Inside our themes folder, we are going to create a file called theme.json. For those unfamiliar with JSON, JSON files are created with the JSON extension. The name of our file is very important. WordPress is going to look at the specific file name in our themes root directory. It's completely optional to define a theme.json file. If WordPress finds this file, the settings from this file will be applied to the full site editor. Inside this file, we can configure the editor by adding colors, fonts, and spacing rules. Additional features include enabling or disabling settings, adding custom templates, and adding styles to blocks. As theme developers, we can use this feature for tailoring the editing experience. For example, rather than letting users pick ugly colors, we can recommend colors that'll match our theme. This section will explore the various settings available in the theme.json file. Before getting started, let's reset our template. Switch back to the browser. This is a good opportunity to discuss another feature of templates. Users have complete freedom of modifying the base template in our theme. However, these changes do not directly affect our files. For example, I'm going to save the changes I've made to the template. Next, let's open the index.html file in our theme. WordPress does not directly modify our theme's template files. Our template files are preserved. Instead, WordPress will make a copy of our template. The copy is stored in the database. Once the user changes our template, the copy in the database will have priority over the original copy. This feature gives users more power. In some cases, you may not like the changes made to a template. It is entirely possible to revert the changes. Switch back to the editor. At the top center of the page, we have the option of switching templates. If a template has been modified, WordPress will provide the option of resetting a template. Let's revert the template and save our changes. Keep in mind, this option does not reset global styles. It only reverts the blocks to their original state. This feature is going to come in handy. Throughout this course, we are going to modify the template in the editor. If the editor is not accurately reflecting the template in your theme, you may want to check if WordPress has a different copy by resetting the template. In this lecture, we are going to load a schema for our JSON file. Schemas are optional, but they're incredibly helpful for avoiding spelling errors and debugging. To find out why, let's open the theme.json file in our editors. Next, let's add an object with a property called version. The first property in your theme.json file should always be version. WordPress is constantly evolving. However, it tries its best to be backward compatible. The settings of the theme.json file have changed over time. The early adopters may still be using an older version of the theme.json file. Therefore, we need to tell WordPress what version we'll be using. The latest version is 2. The value for this property should be a number. So far, so good. However, it's possible we may have made a mistake. For example, what if we capitalized the V in the property name? Property names are case sensitive. WordPress will not be able to detect the version of our property. Let's try creating another problem. Instead of a number, let's wrap our value in quotes. Our JSON file has 2 errors. Unfortunately, they will go unnoticed. Neither WordPress nor our editor will inform us of our mistakes. For these reasons, we should use a schema. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to the documentation page for the schema. According to the documentation, a schema is available to help us address these issues. Schemas are not specific to WordPress. They apply to all JSON files. The purpose of a schema is to double-check your properties and values. A schema can help the editor understand the structure of a JSON file. They can validate a JSON file. If you make a mistake, an error will notify you of your mistake. A schema can be applied to a JSON file by adding the $schema property. The documentation provides an example that we can copy. Let's grab it. Next, let's paste it at the top of our object in the theme.json file. Be sure to add a comma. After adding this property, Visual Studio Code should begin validating your file. For some of you, this may work immediately. For others, you may receive an error. This error will appear if the editor is unable to download the schema. There are 2 solutions for fixing this issue. The first solution is to convert the URL from the HTTPS to HTTP. However, you may not be comfortable with the idea of using an unsecured connection. An alternative solution is to grab the full URL. The URL provided by the WordPress documentation is a proxy URL. To better understand, let's click on the link. In our browser, the URL will redirect us to a GitHub page. The URL in the address bar is completely different from the URL provided by the documentation. This URL is the true location for the schema. Rather than using the documentation's URL, we can switch over to the true URL. Our editor will be able to grab the schema. By doing so, it'll be able to validate our JSON file. There are two new errors that haven't been there before. If we hover our mouse over the opening curly brackets, the error will state our file is missing the version property. Sounds strange, right? The version property exists in our file. However, look closely at the casing. The original name has all lowercase letters, whereas our property has a capitalized V. It becomes clear as to what's wrong. The names don't match. Let's quickly fix the casing. After making those adjustments, the errors have gone away. Perfect. Well, almost. Another error has appeared. This time, the error is related to the value. According to the error, the type is incorrect. The data type for the version property should be an integer. Let's remove the quotes from the number. Voila! Our file is error-free. Prior to adding the schema, these errors remained undetected. While optional, schemas are incredibly valuable for developers. They allow us to quickly debug our JSON files. This reduces the likelihood of WordPress not understanding our settings. I highly recommend keeping the schema option in your file. In the next lecture, let's continue with extending the global styles for our theme. In this lecture, we are going to begin extending the global styles by adding colors to the color palette. The color palette is a series of colors that the user can choose from. Optionally, they can add custom colors to the color palette. Let's explore the color palette in the editor before modifying it. Inside the Gutenberg editor, we are modifying the index templates. On the right side, let's open the Global Styles sidebar. If we were to click on the Colors option, we would be given the option to modify. You can click on the Palette option to add colors. By default, WordPress will provide a few colors to help you get started. If you're developing a theme, you should consider disabling WordPress's default color palette. If you intend on recommending colors, providing too many options can be overbearing. Less is more. Therefore, you should remove WordPress's recommendations. At the end of the day, it's completely up to you. For our theme, we are going to be adding a lot of colors. It makes sense to remove the default palette. Let's give it a try. Switch over to your editor. We will be working with the theme.json file. Inside the root object, add a new property called settings with an initial value of an object. The settings object allows us to modify the settings related to the editor. For a better description, you can hover your mouse over the property name. As long as you're adding the schema to the file, descriptions will be available for most properties. Without the schema, we wouldn't be given this description. As you can see, WordPress states that we can modify which customization settings are available to the user. You may be wondering, how do I know what settings are available? There are two resources worth checking out. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to both resources. The first resource provides a beginner's guide to the theme.json file. If you're getting started with theme development, this resource will provide examples and descriptions of what you can do with the theme.json file. As for the second resource, it's not as beginner-friendly. This reference will provide a complete list of all available options in the theme.json file. For example, we are given the name, type, and default value of each property. If these resources feel overwhelming, don't worry. Throughout this section, we are going to review the most important settings for theme development. Don't feel pressured to add every option available. Let's head back to our editors. Inside the settings object, add another object called colors. The description for this property says the following: settings related to color. We're on the right track. Inside this object, we can add a property called default palette. By default, this property is set to true. Setting this property to true will allow WordPress to recommend colors. We can disable this feature by setting this property to false. Let's refresh the editor in our browsers. If we take a peek at the colors section of the global styles, things are going to be different. Unlike before, the palette will be completely empty. To be clear, we haven't disabled the option to pick colors. Users can still add custom colors to their theme. By setting the default palette property to false, WordPress will not recommend colors. Let's keep playing around with colors in the next set of lectures. In this lecture, we are going to enable the default palette for the site title block. Previously, we disabled the default color palette on a global level. This action carries large implications. Disabling the default palette will be reflected on a global level. If blocks have support for picking colors, the default selection will be removed. For example, in our template, we have the site title block. Let's view the settings for this block. If you were to click on the block, the settings might not appear. This is because the Global Styles sidebar is opened. You can switch to viewing a block's settings by clicking on the cog icon at the top right corner. Under the settings, there will be a panel called Colors. If we were to view any of the colors, the default palette has been removed from the block. In some cases, you may not want to apply settings to all blocks. Alternatively, you can apply settings to specific blocks. For example, let's try enabling the default palette for the site title block. In your editor, open the theme.json file. Inside the settings object, add a property called blocks. This property's value will be an object. According to the description, we can apply settings to specific blocks. We're not forced to apply settings on a global level. WordPress allows us to be more precise with our configuration. Inside this object, we need to provide the block's name registered with the editor. The question is, how do we get the name? Let's head over to the developer resource to find this information. On the home page, we are presented with links to different resources. Resources related to the block editor can be found under the block editor link. Let's click on it. The block editor handbook will provide information related to the Gutenberg editor. This includes information on the core blocks of WordPress. On the sidebar, there's a menu called References. If we view these links, there's a link for viewing the list of core blocks. Before clicking this link, I want to point out the theme.json link. If you ever lose the link for modifying this file, you can find it here. Alright, let's view the core blocks reference link. If you're unable to find this link, check out the resource section of this lecture. I provide a direct link to this page. On this page, let's search for the site title block. Under each block, WordPress will provide a description, name, category, list of supported features, and attributes. At the moment, the most important piece of information is the name. Everything else will be revisited in a future lecture. Copy the name to your clipboard. Next, head on over to your editor. Inside the blocks object, we will paste the name as a property name. The value for the block will be an object. After adding the block name, we can modify the block's settings the same way we would on a global level. Therefore, we copy and paste the color object. The main goal was to add the default palette to the site title block. Let's toggle the value to true. Time to test our code. In your browser, try viewing the colors for the site title block. Awesome! The default color palette appears for the block. WordPress gives us a lot of flexibility with configuring the site editor. There's one key point I want to mention. If a block does not support a feature, enabling it will not do anything. The block has to have support for a feature for it to be enabled. Let's continue our discussion in the next lecture. In this lecture, we are going to add colors to the palette. Currently, the user will not receive color recommendations. They're completely on their own. For the best editing experience possible, we should recommend colors that match our theme. Additional colors can be added through the theme.json file. In your editor, open this file. As you can probably guess, we can add colors through the Settings color property. Inside the color object, add a property called palette with an initial value of an empty array. Inside this array, we can insert objects for each color that we'd like to add. Let's try adding white. Each object will need 3 properties. The first property will be called slug. The slug is an ID for our color. As we've learned, WordPress will add colors to our theme, which we've disabled. Plugins are also capable of adding colors. We can help WordPress identify a color by assigning it an ID. This is to prevent clashing colors from other plugins. For this example, let's set the slug to U-White. We are prefixing our ID with the letter U, which is short for Udemy. That's the name of our theme. Whenever possible, we should avoid duplicating ID names. If our ID was called white, it's likely there may be another color with the same name. To prevent naming conflicts, it's recommended to prefix your ID names. For the rest of this course, we are going to apply prefixes. Let's move on to adding the color. The next property is called color. WordPress allows us to use various values for the color. The following values are supported: hex, RGB, RGBA, color names, keywords, HSL, HSLA. For this course, we are going to stick with hex codes and RGB. Back in our code, let's set the color to the following value: RGB 255, 255, 255. This value will set the color to white. We're almost finished. The last required property is called name. The name property will be a human-readable name of our color. Unlike the slug, this value will be presented to the user on the editor. Let's set the name to Udemy White. We've successfully added our first color. Let's try viewing the color palette in the browser. Awesome! Our color is available as a choice in the palette. You can hover your mouse over the color to view the name. A tooltip should appear with the value from the name property. It's time to add the rest of the colors. We're going to have over 15 colors. To prevent the course from becoming repetitive, check out the resource section of this lecture. You will find a link to a complete list of colors for our theme. Copy the entire list of colors. Next, head back to your editor. After the first color, paste in the list of colors. Make sure you add the comma after the first object. Feel free to play around with the colors. Each object is very similar to one another. Colors must have a slug, color, and name. Before testing our code, let's add one more color. Similar to the default palette property, we can add custom colors to a specific block. Let's expand on our example of the site title block. Inside the color object, add the palette property. The format is the same as before. Let's quickly add the primary color to the palette. Inside the array, add an object with a property called slug. The slug will be set to uPrimary. Next, add the color property. Let's try using a hex code. The value for this color will be the following: #EF4444. Lastly, the name property will be set to Udemy Primary. If our assumptions are correct, This color should only be available to the site title block. Let's try viewing the color palette on the Global Style sidebar. If you can view the complete list of colors, you've successfully added a custom palette for your theme. To verify the colors, you can hover your mouse over the colors for the tooltip. The names should reflect the names in the theme.json file. Let's try viewing the color palette for the site title block. The color palette from this block will completely override the global palette. This behavior is important to understand. WordPress will prioritize block-specific settings over global settings. By adding a custom color palette for a block, the global palette will not be provided or merged. So, that's how colors are added to a theme. In the next lecture, let's continue our discussion of colors. In this lecture, we will explore the color palette for different CSS properties. WordPress allows us to toggle the palette for backgrounds, text, and links. In addition, these settings can be modified on a global level or block level. Let's get into it. In the WordPress admin dashboard, let's look at the various color settings available. For example, under the Global Styles sidebar, we can change the color of the background color and text. We're not limited to these CSS properties. Links are supported too. Through our theme.json file, we can enable or disable each property. Let's try playing around with these settings. Open the theme file in your editor. Before adding new properties, let's minimize the palette section. In most editors, you can fold your code by pressing the button on the left side. This feature doesn't delete code. It simply hides it. I'll be using this feature throughout most of this course. Moving on, let's add 3 properties to the color object called background, text, and link. Each property will be set to true. These properties will toggle the color palette for their respective properties. By default, the background and text properties are enabled. The link property is disabled. For this example, we're going to allow users to modify all colors. Before testing our code, let's learn how to enable these properties for a block. For example, the site title block supports colors for text and links. However, the link property is disabled. Inside the color object for the site title block, add the link property with a value of true. Let's try testing our code. Inside the editor, let's view the color options from the Global Styles sidebar. As you can see, we can manipulate the background, text, and link color. Up next, let's try viewing the settings for the site title block. Previously, the link option was not available. However, by enabling it in our theme.json file, we've allowed users to change the color of the title. Feel free to play around with these settings. Setting the background and text properties to true is overkill for our theme. However, I'm going to leave these options alone for example purposes. Let's continue exploring additional options in the next lecture. In this lecture, we're going to explore the option of disabling custom colors. Throughout this section, we've been focused on the color palette. Users are not forced to use our recommended colors. If they would like, they can select a custom color. Based on certain circumstances, you may need to disable the color picker. This is an uncommon situation, but possible. We can disable the color picker on a global level or block level. Let's explore both options. In your editor, open the theme.json file. The custom color picker can be disabled by adding a property called custom to the color object. Next, let's try disabling the color picker for the site title block by adding the same property and value to the color object. This step is redundant, but it does demonstrate how to apply this setting to an individual block. Let's try refreshing the page. If you were to attempt to change the color through the Global Styles sidebar, WordPress would not allow you to select a custom color. We're limited to the color palette. In my opinion, disabling the color picker isn't the best idea. We should allow users freedom to select colors. They may need it. For this reason, I'm going to enable the color picker by changing the value to true. As for the site title block, we are going to disable the color picker for example purposes. Feel free to remove it. Let's start talking about duotones in the next lecture. In this lecture, we are going to start getting into duotones. This is probably one of the most interesting features for customizing a site with colors. The idea of a duotone is simple. A duotone is a filter that can be applied to images or videos. Essentially, the filter applies to colors. On this slide, I've provided some examples. Duotones are similar to Instagram filters, but there is a big difference. An Instagram filter will adjust the color levels of an image, whereas a duotone filter will completely override the colors of an image. For this reason, duotones are recommended for images with high contrast. This feature can be cool, but be warned. This feature is experimental. The WordPress team has stated that there are some bugs. You should be cautious with this feature. Regardless, let's learn how to add duotones to our theme. In your editor, open the theme.json file. By default, duotones are enabled. We can apply them to blocks that add images to a template, such as the image, cover, and site logo blocks. Similar to colors, we have the option of adding custom duotones. Let's give that a try. Inside the color object, add a property called duotone. Its value will be an array. This format for adding a duotone is similar to registering a color. The array must contain a list of objects with the properties slug, colors, and name. Let's add our first duotone. For the slug, let's set the ID to UPinkSunset. Next, add an array called colors. Here's where things become different. Duotones are created with two colors, which are the shadow and highlight. The shadow represents the dark color, and the highlight represents the lighter color. Inside this array, we must add shadow and highlight in this order. If you forget the order, you can hover your mouse over the colors array for a hint. Keep in mind, duotones offer limited support for color values. Only hex and RGB values are accepted. The colors for our duotone will be the following: 11245E and DC4379. Lastly, let's give our duotone a name. The name will be the following: Udemy Pink Sunset. Before testing our duotone, let's learn how to disable this feature in our theme. As I said before, duotones are available for most blocks that have images. The cover block is one example. Let's disable duotone for this block. In the blocks object, add a property called core/cover. To save time, I will give you the name of the cover block. You can verify the name with the reference. Inside this object, add the color object. There are two settings for completely disabling the block. The first setting is the duotone property. If you were to add this property without a series of duotones, WordPress would not provide a list of duotone colors. However, users will be able to select custom duotone colors. We can disable the custom color picker for duotones by setting the custom duotone option to false. Alternatively, you can disable the custom color picker while providing a series of duotones. It's completely up to you. Let's try testing our new features in the browser. I'm going to quickly upload an image through the image block. A duotone can be applied to an image from the toolbar. If we were to select this option, our duotone should appear as an option. Let's try applying it to our image. Pretty cool, right? Duotones can be a great way to enhance the appearance of an image. There's not much else to say about duotones. They're an experimental feature for applying colorful effects to an image. In this lecture, we are going to add gradients to our theme. A gradient is very simple. It's an effect with two or more colors transitioning to one another. WordPress supports all CSS gradients. They can be applied to a wide variety of blocks. Interestingly, gradients are persistent. If a user has gradients and switches themes, the original gradients will survive from older themes. Overall, adding gradients to a theme is super simple. Let's give it a shot, shall we? In your editor, open the theme.json file. First things first, let's try hiding the default gradients from the user. Similar to colors, WordPress will provide the user with a preset of gradients. If you are developing a theme, you may want to recommend your own set of gradients. For our purposes, let's disable the default set of gradients. In the color object, add a property called default gradients with a value of false. Next, let's begin adding a custom set of gradients. Gradients can be added on a global level and block level. For our purposes, let's add a global level gradient. Inside the color object, add an array called gradients. In the array, we must add an object for each gradient. The format for a gradient is the slug, name, and gradient. Let's add our first gradient. The slug for the gradient will be called USummerDog. The name for the gradient will be the following: Udemy Summer Dog. Lastly, the gradient can be added through the gradient property. WordPress accepts any valid CSS gradient value. We can add linear, radial, conic, or repeating gradients. For this example, let's keep it simple by adding a linear gradient. Set the value to the following: linear gradient hash A8FF78, hash 78FFD6. Before testing our gradient, let's learn how to disable the gradient feature. I think the site title block doesn't need to support gradients. Let's disable it completely for this block, which has support for gradients. Scroll to the site title block settings. Inside the color object, add the gradients array. By adding an empty array, WordPress will not present the user with a set of gradients to select from. However, users will still be able to select custom colors for creating a gradient. We can disable the custom color picker by adding the custom gradient property with a value of false. These settings should effectively disable the gradient options for the site title block. Let's try testing our settings. Refresh the editor in the browser. Under the Global Styles sidebar, let's try changing the background color with a gradient. The list of presets will present us with our custom gradient. You can hover your mouse over the option for the name of the gradient. Perfect. Next, let's try editing the site title block. Unlike the Global Style sidebar, adding a gradient to this block is not an option. We've successfully disabled this option from the editor. Once again, feel free to explore gradients with additional colors and settings. We're almost finished with colors, I promise. There are just a few more topics to discuss before jumping into other areas of the editor. I'll see you in the next one. In this lecture, we are going to start applying colors to specific blocks. So far, users have had to select their preferred colors for each block. It would be nice if we could set a default color. WordPress allows us to configure the default colors through the theme.json file. Open this file in your editor. Next, let's add a new property at the root level of the object. The name of the new property will be called styles. Let's hover our mouse over this property to read the description. Organized way to set CSS properties. Styles in the top level will be added in the body selector. As its name suggests, this property is an object of styles that we can apply to our theme. This option gives us the opportunity to configure the styles values for different elements and blocks. Users will be able to tweak these settings. You should view these styles as a starting point for our theme. To get started, let's change the text color of our theme. At the moment, the text color is pure black. In my opinion, I prefer a text color in the grayish area. Luckily, we have 9 gray colors in our theme. Let's try using them. In the Settings object, search for a gray color. I'm going to use the Udemy Gray 700 color. Copy the value to your clipboard. Next, back in the Styles object, add a property called Color. The Color object is where we can modify the colors of our page. Since we're not modifying a specific block, this property will affect the color of the entire document. We can change the text color by adding the text property. Let's set it to our copied value. Next, let's try viewing the editor in the browser. At the moment, we have a site title block. Let's try adding a paragraph block. Otherwise, we won't be able to properly view the changes. After adding a paragraph block, try inspecting the element. The color should have been applied through the color property. WordPress will add the property to a selector called Editor Styles Wrapper. This solution works, but we can take it a step further. Rather than hard-coding the color, let's try using a variable. The color already exists as a variable. Under the Elements panel, click on the body element to inspect its properties. If you scroll through the properties, you should come across a long list of CSS variables. In fact, you'll be able to find our custom colors. The names are slightly different. WordPress will extract the colors from the theme.json file. These colors will be added to WordPress's list of variables. All variables are prefixed with the WP preset color keyword. Therefore, we can find our text color under the variable called WP preset color UGray 700. Let's copy the entire variable name. Before updating our file, let's check out the other variables. WordPress will create variables for gradients and duotones. For example, if you scroll through the list, you'll find our summer dog gradient. Unlike colors, the prefix for a gradient is WP preset gradient. For duotones, the preset is WP preset duotone. Under this list, you should be able to find the pink sunset duotone. Alright, let's try updating our theme. Back in the editor, replace the hard-coded value for the text color with our variable. The variable should be wrapped with the var function. It's completely valid to use variables. After making those changes, let's view the editor. You may need to add a paragraph element before inspecting the color. Once more, looking through the properties, the color property is being set to our variable. Perfect. Of course, users are not restricted to our colors. They have the option of changing the text color. Open the Global Styles sidebar. If we were to look at the Colors section, we're going to notice something different. Previously, WordPress did not pre-select a color. However, by setting the color in our theme, the color is pre-selected. WordPress is smart enough to detect that the color is part of our preset. These changes are not exclusive to the backend. The front end of our site has been modified too. Let's check out the homepage. Next, let's view the body tags CSS properties with the developer tools. As you can see, the color gets applied to the front. WordPress is more than capable of modifying our document's styles in the front end and back end. We were able to accomplish this action without writing a single line of PHP. There's one more thing I want to talk about before ending this lecture. Let's try changing the background color. Switch back to your editor. Inside the color object, we can add another property called background. Similar to the text property, the value for this property can be a valid CSS color value. For our background, we're going to set the color to white. Luckily, we have a color in our variables that stores the color white. Set the property to the following value: var wp preset color u white. Let's refresh the front end. Under the developer tools, the background color property has been added. WordPress makes it incredibly easy to add default values for the background and text color. In the next lecture, let's continue exploring the various options at our disposal for applying colors to blocks. In this lecture, we are going to start applying gradients. I should mention that colors can be applied to blocks. It's not necessary to apply colors on a global level. Let's try applying these settings to specific blocks. In your editor, open the theme.json file. We're going to update the styles object. Add a new property called blocks. The blocks property will be an object that contains a list of blocks. The process is exactly similar to modifying a block's settings. Inside this object, we must add the name of the block. For this example, let's try changing the default color of a button. The name of the button block is called core/button. You can refer to the reference for the official name. Next, we can start changing the default stylings. The properties for modifying a block's colors are the same as changing them on a global level. We can modify the color through the colors property. Unlike before, gradients must be specified through a different property. We can't set the background color of a button with the background property. Instead, we need to add a property called gradient. The value for this property must be a valid CSS value for a gradient. Let's try reusing our gradient. As a reminder, WordPress will create variables from your custom colors, gradients, and duotones. All gradients are prefixed with the WP preset gradient keyword. The full name of our gradient is WP preset gradient U summer dog. After making those adjustments, let's try refreshing the page. If we were to add a new button to the template, the background color should be our new gradient. As expected, our gradient has been applied. Perfect. In my opinion, the gradient doesn't work well for the button. However, I'm going to leave it as the default background color for example purposes. Feel free to remove the gradient from the block. In the next lecture, let's keep applying colors to our elements. In this lecture, we're going to apply styles to regular elements. Thus far, we've been applying styles on a global level or block level. In some cases, you may want to apply styles to specific elements. At the moment, WordPress supports custom styles for links and headings. Other elements are not supported. For this demonstration, we are going to change the default color of our links. Let's set the text color to the primary color from our theme. Inside your editor, open the theme.json file. Next, inside the styles object, add a new object called elements. Inside this object, we must specify the name of the element we'd like to apply styles to. Surprisingly, WordPress has a special name for links. Technically, the name of the element for links is called anchor. However, WordPress uses the word link. After adding the name, we can start applying styles to the link. Before we do, I want to quickly mention the names of headings. we can change the headings of a document with their HTML names. For example, if you would like to change the color of the H1 tag, the name would be H1. Back to our previous example. Inside this object, we can change the color and background. The text color can be changed with the text property. The value will be the following: WP preset color U primary. Next, let's refresh the full site editor. Our site title block has been modified. The color has changed from blue to our primary color. Changing the links will apply to all blocks. For further demonstration, let's try adding a paragraph block with a link. Perfect! The link for the block matches the color from our theme's settings. Hopefully, as time goes on, WordPress will support styling for all or most elements. In the next lecture, let's finalize our discussion of colors by applying them to borders. In this lecture, we are going to finish our discussion of colors by modifying borders. Most blocks support borders. By default, these blocks will disable border settings. Therefore, we need to take extra steps to enable this feature before changing the color. To get started, open the theme.json file. The settings for configuring borders can be tricky. The process is slightly different from other settings. First things first, we need to enable the border settings. We can enable borders through the settings object. Inside this object, add an object called border. Borders are more complicated than other properties. A border has a style, width, color, and radius. WordPress gives us the option of modifying all border properties. Alternatively, we can have partial support for borders. For example, let's enable all border settings. Inside the border object, add the following properties: color, radius, style, and width. The value for these properties is booleans. By default, they're all false. In our example, we're turning them on. Keep in mind, a block has to support border settings. Before testing our configuration, let's add some default styles for our borders. To mix things up, let's modify the border settings for the pull quote block. Scroll to the Styles section. Inside the Blocks object, we can add our block with the name core/pull quote. Next, we can add the border object to begin adding styles. As a reminder, we are modifying the styles. The options for styles are different than the options for changing the settings. We can't enable or disable the border settings from this object. The property names are going to be similar, but they require different values. If you want to enable border settings for a specific block, you must do it from the settings object. Inside the border object, we're going to modify all border styles. First, let's set the width property to 2px. Afterward, set the radius property to 10px. Next, set the style property to solid. Lastly, let's set the color property to the WP preset color U primary variable. As you can tell, the values for these properties must be valid CSS values. Time to test our code. In your browser, try adding the pull quote block to the template. After adding this block, our default stylings have been applied. If users don't like the styles, that's perfectly fine. The border settings are freely modifiable from the sidebar. By enabling all border settings, users can modify the width, color, style, and radius of a border. Finally, we're finished with the color settings. WordPress provides us with dozens of options for modifying the colors of a theme. From global level settings to block-specific settings. Hopefully, you will be able to leverage these options for your themes. Now that we've finished working with colors, let's move our discussion to typography settings. In this lecture, we will begin our discussion of WordPress's typography settings for themes. To begin, we're going to start with font families. Unfortunately, we won't be able to fully verify the font family settings for our theme. The theme.json file does not provide an option for loading fonts. This operation must be performed with PHP. However, we can add font family settings. In the next section, we are going to load the font family. For now, as long as the option is available in the editor, we can consider the mission complete. Our theme will support two fonts called Pacifico and Rubik. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to both fonts. They are completely free and available on Google Fonts. For this demonstration, the Rubik font will be available as an option on a global level. As for the Pacifico font, this font will only be available for the site title block. Let's begin. Open the theme.json file. First, let's add the font to the Styles sidebar. Inside the Settings object, add a new object called Typography. New font families can be configured under the Typography object. Next, we must add an array called Font Families. Inside this array, we can add our custom fonts. Each font is represented by an object. Let's add the Rubik font. Each object must have three properties. The first property is called Font Family. The value for this property must be a valid CSS value. It's recommended to provide alternative font families if a font can't be loaded. Let's set the font to the following: Rubik Sans Serif. Next, let's add a property called Slug. As we've learned thus far, the slug property will act as a unique identifier for our theme. This is to help WordPress identify a font family. Like most slugs, you should prefix a slug to avoid naming collisions. Let's set the slug to uRubik. The last property is called Name. The value for this property should be a human-readable name. It will be displayed on the drop-down options for font families. The name of our font family will be called Udemy Rubik. We've successfully added our first font family. Let's add another. This time, the font family will be exclusive to the site title block. The settings are exactly the same. In fact, let's make a copy of the typography object. Afterward, open the blocks object inside the settings property, not to be confused with the blocks object from the styles object. We're going to modify the site title block. Inside this object, paste in the typography object. The typography object should be sitting side by side with the colors object. The final step is to convert the values to the second font, which is Pacifico. Change the font family from Rubik to Pacifico. Change the slug from uRubik to uPacifico. Lastly, change the name from Udemy Rubik to Udemy Pacifico. If we did everything right, these options should be available in our theme. In your browser, refresh the editor. First, let's check the Global Styles sidebar. Under the Typography section, we can modify the settings for text and links. Either section will have an option for changing the font family. Looking closely at the Font Family option, our font family has been added. Awesome! Let's review the settings for the site title block. You may or may not be able to find the settings for the font family. If that's the case, you can toggle the font family option by clicking on the three dots from the typography panel. The font family may be hidden. If you were to click on this option, the font family option should appear. As you can see, our font family has been added. The option for selecting the Rubik font will disappear. This is important to remember. Changing the font families for a specific block will override the options for the global fonts. You can select the font family to apply it to our title. However, the font will not be accurate. The browser has fallen back to the other font specified in our value. It does change, it's just not the right font. This is because we haven't loaded the font into our theme. Unfortunately, we will not be able to thoroughly test this option until the next section. Don't worry, we'll definitely learn how to load custom fonts into a theme. For now, as long as the option is available within the editor, we're good to go. So, that's how you can add font families to the editor. In the following lecture, let's continue our discussion of typography. In this lecture, we are going to change the font size options for our theme. WordPress allows users to customize the font size options for various blocks. It's a heavily supported feature. As usual, we can recommend font sizes to our users. These sizes should match our theme. To get started, open the theme.json file. Font sizes can be recommended on a global level or block-specific level. Let's look at both examples. First, let's suggest some global font sizes. We can configure font sizes through the typography object in the settings section. Inside this object, add a new property called font sizes. The value for this property is an array of objects where each object represents a single font size. Let's try adding a new font size. By default, WordPress will recommend a series of font sizes in pixels. In my opinion, pixels are not the greatest unit measurement for web design. The most common and reliable unit measurement is rem. Let's convert the font sizes to rem. First, we need to add a slug. Before we add the slug, let's talk about the default font sizes by WordPress. WordPress has 4 font sizes, which are called small, medium, large, and extra large. As you can see, they're using pixels. By creating a new set of font sizes, WordPress will not delete these variables from the document. Interestingly, WordPress allows us to override these values with our own. The question becomes, why would we want to do that? It's simple. Clients may not want to use our themes in the future. Transitioning from one theme to another should be painless as possible. Therefore, the WordPress community strongly encourages developers to override the font sizes for WordPress's existing variables. By doing so, clients can easily move from theme to theme. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to a blog post with more information on this topic. I highly recommend reading this blog post after you're finished this lecture. It's not an official recommendation, but it has gained traction. For the best possible experience for our clients, we're going to override WordPress's default values with our own. Switch back to your editor. For the first font size, we're going to change the size for the small option. Set the slug property to small. We don't need to include the entire variable name. The name after the prefix is all we need. Next, let's set the size property, which will be the value for the variable. For this example, we're going to use the following value, 0.75 rem. Lastly, we can add a human-readable name for our size with the name property. Set the name to small. The process for updating the other variables will be the same. Let's create 4 additional copies of this object. The names will be the following: medium, large, extra large, gigantic. Lastly, the sizes will be the following: 1.25 rem, 2.25 rem, 3 rem, 3.75 rem. The gigantic size is not an official size. However, we're adding it in to test custom sizes. After making those changes, our font sizes should appear in the editor. Before testing our code, let's learn how to add font sizes to a block. Let's take it a step further by completely disabling font sizes for the pre-formatted block. The pre-formatted block allows us to write text with preserved whitespace and formatting. The primary purpose of this block is to display code. In my opinion, it's probably a good idea to restrict typography options. This type of behavior will vary from theme to theme. First, we should select the block. Inside the blocks object, add the core/preformatted block. Next, add the typography object. 2 properties must be added to completely disable the font size options. Firstly, we must add the font sizes property with a value of an empty array. By adding an empty array, WordPress will not provide the user with a selection of predefined sizes. However, users will be able to configure a custom font size. This option can be hidden by setting the custom font size property to false. Great! Let's try testing the results in the editor. First, let's check out the Global Styles sidebar. Under the sidebar, the typography options will display our custom font sizes. This includes our gigantic font size. Just in case, we should verify WordPress's variables were overridden with ours. Open the Developer Tools. Under the Elements panel, select the body tag. If we were to scroll through the long list of variables, we should find the font size variables. As you can see, the variables are being set to our theme's custom sizes. WordPress is not duplicating these variables. If a user were to switch themes, they should be able to seamlessly do so. Let's move on to testing the pre-formatted block. Add this block to your template. After adding this block, let's check out the typography settings. Users will not be able to change the font size. We've completely restricted this block. Perfect! Let's move on to other typography settings. In this lecture, we will review the other settings for enabling or disabling typography features. There's not much to say. Let's quickly run through them. In your editor, open the theme.json file. All settings will be applied to the typography object under the settings object. The first setting that can be toggled is line height. The value for this property must be a boolean. Let's set it to true. This setting will allow users to modify the line height CSS property. Most blocks with typography settings can have their line height modified. By default, customizing the line height is disabled. Up next, let's add a property called drop cap with a value of true. The drop cap property will enable the option of enlarging the first letter of a paragraph. Currently, the paragraph block is the only block that supports this option. Afterward, we can enable the font weight option by setting it to true. The font weight refers to the text thickness. Next, let's add the font style property with a value of true. The font style property allows users to add italic text. The next property on our list is called text transform. The value for this property will be true. This property will change text casing, such as uppercase, lowercase, or capitalization. We're almost finished. The spacing between letters can be enabled by setting the letter spacing property to true. Lastly, underlines and strike-throughs can be enabled by adding the text decoration property with a value of true. To be clear, most of these settings are already enabled. Setting them to true is redundant. However, I'm including them for example purposes. Let's check out the editor in the browser. The best way to test our settings is by adding a paragraph block to our template. The paragraph block has support for all typography settings. Under the sidebar, you should be able to find the typography settings. Initially, most settings may be hidden. You can toggle their appearances under the More menu item. From this list, we can modify the line height, letter case, letter spacing, and drop cap. As you can see, WordPress provides us with plenty of options for modifying the appearance of our text. Keep in mind, these settings can be modified on a block level too. These typography settings should cover most use cases. We're almost finished with our discussion of typography. I'll see you in the next lecture. In this lecture, we're going to wrap up our discussion of typography by setting some initial values. We can apply styles on a global level or block level. As always, it's considered good practice to establish default values for your theme. For example, our theme will be using the Rubik font for the entire document. At the moment, this is not true. We will need to configure the styles to set the default font. Let's get started. In your editor, open the theme.json file. We're going to switch our focus to the styles object. Inside this object, we can begin adding typography styles by adding the typography object. To begin, we're going to modify the font family by adding the font family property. If we hover our mouse over this property, we can verify the CSS property that gets modified by adding it. The value for this property must be a valid CSS value. As we've learned earlier, WordPress will create variables from our theme file. This includes font families. We can set this property to the following value: var wp preset font family u Rubik. Variables for font families are prefixed with the wp preset font family keyword. This prefix is followed by our slug. As a reminder, our theme doesn't have custom fonts loaded. This is a topic we'll tackle in the next lecture. As long as the property gets updated, we'll consider this solution a success. Let's try changing the font size by adding the font size property. This property will be set to 16px. Afterward, we can change the font style of our document by setting the font style property. For our theme, this property will be set to normal. I think it would be awkward if our entire document were italicized. Setting it to normal is considered standard. Let's move on to the next property, which is called font weight. The value for this property will be normal. Afterward, we're going to configure the line height by setting the line height property to inherit. Up next, we'll set the text decoration by adding the text decoration property with an initial value of none. Lastly, the casing can be configured by adding the text transform property. The value for this property will be none. I ran by this configuration really fast. However, none of these properties should be new to you. Once again, you can hover your mouse over these properties for the name of the CSS property that will be modified. As long as you have the schema in your file, a description should be available. Some of these values are the default values. It's not entirely beneficial to add them. However, it's never a bad idea to reset your CSS for backward compatibility. Before testing our code, let's try applying a font family to the site title block. By default, WordPress does not use our custom font as the default font family. Let's configure the site title block to use our custom font as the default font family. We can apply the same typography settings to a specific block. Inside the blocks section, we're going to update the core/site title object. Add the typography object to the block. Next, set the font family property to the following value: WP preset font family U Pacifico. We're not going to modify the other settings. Let's give our styles a test. For testing, let's try viewing the properties on the front end of our site. Using the developer tools, search for the body tag in the Elements panel. Perfect! Our styles were applied to the body element. Keep in mind, these styles will not be applied to elements that override these properties. This is simply a base. Let's check out the styles for the site title block. The font family is being set to Pacifico. Awesome! We're finished with exploring the typography options of our theme. In this lecture, we're going to start exploring another section of our theme file by adding layout options. Layout options can configure the width of our content, margins, padding, and block gaps. To begin, we're going to set the content width of our posts. In the WordPress admin dashboard, try editing a post. We're not going to be viewing the full site editor for this example. Instead, these settings will apply to post content. You may have noticed this already, but the content sits on the left side of the document. The width of our post takes up the entire page. In reality, the width of your post may not be full width. Instead, you may want the width to be fixed. WordPress provides theme developers with two options for changing the width of the content. These settings apply to posts, but not the full site editor. That's perfectly fine. We want the full site editor to have complete control of the editor, not a portion. Let's begin configuring the width of our posts. In your editor, open the theme.json file. We can add layout settings by adding a property called layout to the settings object. The first setting is called content size. The content size property configures the default width for all blocks. Instead of having a block stretch from one side of the page to the other, we can set the maximum width. For our theme, most posts should have a max width. The value for this property will vary from theme to theme. Let's set the width to 800 px. You're more than welcome to use other units of measurement. For example, you can use rem. However, for our theme, pixels are more than suitable. The second property is called wide size. This property is optional. If you add it in, WordPress will allow blocks to extend outside the bounds of the content. You can configure how wide a block can stretch. If that doesn't make sense, don't worry. I'll provide a demonstration after configuring our options. For our theme, let's set the wide size property to 1100 px. Time to test our code. Refresh the post editor in your browser. After refreshing the page, things have completely changed. The width of our blocks has been constrained to our theme settings. Adding the width to our theme will help WordPress understand our theme. It'll help the user understand how a page will look on the front end. At the moment, the default width of our blocks is equal to the value of the content size property. Let's check if the wide size property is working. First, we need to add a block that supports wide alignment. In your post, add an image. The image block is an example of a block that has alignment settings. On the toolbar for the block, we can select the alignment option for the various values. If we look closely, the wide option is available. WordPress will even give us the size. By default, WordPress disables the wide option. Adding the wide size property to your theme will enable this option. If we click on it, the image widens. It has extended outside the bounds of the original content width. Perfect! We've successfully added support for content alignment. Let's continue exploring layout options in upcoming lectures. In this lecture, we're going to enable margin and padding options for our theme. By default, these options are disabled. We can enable these settings on a global level and block level. To begin, let's update our theme.json file. Inside the settings object, add a new property called spacing. The spacing property is where we can configure the margin and padding settings for our theme. There are two properties that we can add. They're called margin and padding. Let's add both with a value of true. It's that simple. Users will be able to configure the margin and padding for all blocks that support spacing. While we're here, let's try adding some default styles to our theme. Specifically, we're going to reset the margin and padding. Let's switch over to the styles object. Inside this object, add a new property called spacing. Next, add two properties called margin and padding. We're going to reset the margin and padding for the entire document. Not necessary, but never a bad idea to reset your CSS. WordPress allows us to apply margin and padding to all sides. All units of measurement are supported. Inside both objects, we're going to set the top, right, bottom, and left properties to 0 px. It's optional to add values every property. For example, you may want to apply padding on the y-axis of an element. Therefore, you can omit the right and left properties. It's completely up to you. Let's try testing our site on the front end. Not much will change. However, let's check out the body tag with the developer tools. As you can see, WordPress has applied margin and padding to the body tag. This is precisely what we wanted. Applying spacing to blocks is also possible. Let's try editing the template in the editor. If we were to select the site title block, there should be a panel on the sidebar called Dimensions. It may be empty. You can toggle the appearance of the padding and margin settings through the panel dropdown. By selecting either option, we can modify the spacing with a single value. Alternatively, we can change the spacing on an individual basis. Either way, we've given the user the option of changing the padding and margins of our theme. Let's continue exploring these options in the next lecture. In this lecture, we're going to modify the units for our theme. For layouts, WordPress allows users to use different units of measurement for margin and padding. Let's look at an example. In our editor, let's view the padding settings for the site title block. Next to the input, we can select different units. By default, WordPress will use pixels, but we can switch over to percentages. Believe it or not, WordPress allows theme developers to add or remove units from this dropdown. If you know me, I'm not a huge fan of EM. I think REM is superior. You may feel differently. For our theme, we're going to disable EM as an option. Let's try changing the units. In your text editor, open the theme.json file. In the settings object, we're going to modify the spacing option. Add a new property called units. This property will be an array of units that our theme supports. Let's add the following units: px, rem, %, vw, vh. We're excluding the em unit. That should do it. Try testing our theme settings by refreshing the page in the browser. After doing so, try modifying the site title block's spacing options. The EM unit has been completely removed. In its place, WordPress will load our units. Pretty simple, right? We're almost finished exploring these spacing options. There's just one more setting that we're going to explore. Let's talk about it in the next lecture. In this lecture, we are going to modify the block gap settings for our theme. A block gap refers to the space between blocks that are aligned side by side. In most cases, your content should have room to breathe. If elements are too close to each other, it can make your content appear cluttered. Let's look at an example. The columns block is an example of a block that implements gaps. We're going to quickly add the columns block to our template. The number of columns doesn't matter. As long as there are 2 or more columns, you're good to go. Inside all columns, add an image block. We're going to add images to demonstrate the spacing between columns. As you can see, there's a gap between both images. The size of the gap can be configured. In addition, we can enable settings for allowing users to customize this gap. We're going to enable these settings, as well as increase the default gap. Before we do, let's look at how the gap gets applied. I'm going to save the post. Rather than inspecting the CSS in the editor, we're going to view the home page of our site. WordPress adds additional markup that can be confusing to look at. The final output of the template will be much easier to read. Once you're on the home page, inspect the images. The element we're looking for is a div tag with a class called WP block columns. Looking closely at the styles, WordPress uses Flex for creating columns. The most important property is the gap property. This property will determine the gap between each column. We can't remove this property, but we can override it. Let's try configuring the gap settings for our theme. In your text editor, open the theme.json file. First, let's enable the settings for configuring the gap. In the Settings object, we're going to update the spacing option. Add a new property called block gap with a value of true. You must enable these settings if you want to configure the gap for your theme. Otherwise, WordPress will not allow you to override the value. By turning this setting on, users will be allowed to customize the gap. As theme developers, we should recommend a default gap. I think the gap between images is too small. I would like to give more breathing room to our columns. Scroll to the Styles object. We're going to modify the spacing property. Let's add a property called block gap with a value of 4 rem. The value for the gap must be a valid CSS value. Configuring this value will vary from theme to theme. You will need to experiment with this option for the best possible value. Let's try testing our theme by refreshing the homepage. Awesome! The gap between images has increased. We're going to keep this gap for our theme. Once we start adding the template and asset files, this is going to come out great for our theme. We're finished with our discussion of the layout settings for WordPress. Let's wrap up our discussion in the next lecture. In this lecture, we're going to add one more feature to our theme. Thus far, we've enabled everything. Users will have ultimate control over the appearance of our theme. We've had to write dozens of lines of code to get this behavior. However, there is a shortcut worth looking at. Let's quickly take a look at it. Inside the theme.json file, open the Settings object. At the top of the object, let's add a property called Appearance Tools with a value of true. You can hover your mouse over this property to read the description. According to our editor, this option will enable everything. If you're developing a theme that gives your clients complete freedom, this can be a quick way of supporting all settings. In some cases, it may be better to enable this setting. If you need to disable a feature, you can do so on a per block basis. That wraps up our discussion of the theme.json file. We've written over 100 lines of code. WordPress gives us so much power for customizing the editor with a single file. Hopefully, you can use this file to your advantage for tailoring the editing experience for your clients. Before moving on, let's reset our template. We've made several changes to the template that the original template has been overridden. Switch over to the full site editor for the index.html template. Let's clear the customizations to reset the template. Be sure to save your changes. Otherwise, the reset will not be complete. After making those changes, we can move on to the next set of topics. In the next section, let's begin loading our template. It's time to begin converting our template into a functioning theme. When you're ready, I'll see you in the next section.